If you want it straight. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you may be. In talking to you tonight, we shall try to do two things which are by no means easy. The first is to set before you in chronological order the history of the communist conspiracy from 1776 to the present time. And the second is to condense those 2 centuries of history into 3 hours of narration. We ask for your sympathy, therefore, with regard to our shortcomings and your patience with regard to the time. We shall do our best to keep you interested, and we take it for granted that nobody came here to be entertained, but for much more serious reasons. For the story we shall unfold is of immense importance, not just of abstract importance to the American people as a whole, but of direct, immediate, and vital concern to each of you as an individual. What is very definitely involved in this picture is the freedom and the lives of yourselves and your families, not in some distant decades, but in the very near and quite foreseeable future. Above all, this is a true story in every particular. In such a tenuous outline of so vast a subject, we cannot spare the time for documentation. We cannot even go into an explanation of the background, which would be helpful with regard to many statements that may startle or disturb you. In fact, we shall tear many such statements boldly from earlier materials already published by ourselves without pausing to give you the surrounding context, nor even to name the source. As we keep on moving down the years, however, and you find these items from the past meshing so neatly into a total design with the present pattern which you already recognize, most of your doubts about the earlier history will probably disappear. But the main point we wish to make here is that many dedicated men have spent years in uncovering, verifying, and fitting together the pieces that form the astounding mosaic which we shall now be putting before you. And for those who wish either to prove things out for themselves or to read and study a great deal further in order to acquire a much deeper understanding of the conspiracy, a reading list of books and pamphlets has been prepared specifically to go with this presentation, and any member of our staff can give you a copy or tell you where one may be obtained. 11 years ago, we prepared a speech entitled, "Look at the Score." After being delivered dozens of times, it was used as the opening part of our presentation in the 2-day meeting at which the John Birch Society was founded. Hence, it was then incorporated into the Blue Book of the Society, which was simply a transcript of that presentation. In that speech, we started our survey of the conspiracy at the point where the physical confrontation of the free world with the communists had begun. This was in 1917, when they established themselves in Soviet Russia as a visible headquarters from which to reach out their arms of expansion. We did so because we ourselves did not know, and our audiences were not ready to accept, as much about the earlier history of the conspiracy as is the case today. Everything we said in Look at the Score about the communist advance from 1917 until the date of the speech has held up as entirely accurate. We hope and believe that the same will prove to be true about all that we say now. For even then it was perfectly obvious that when Lenin and Trotsky seized power in Russia in 1917, the conspiracy behind them had not sprung full-grown into existence only a year or two before. This time we go back to the real beginning, because at least an elementary knowledge of the earlier history of the conspiracy is vital to an understanding of what is happening at the present time. So, with that much necessary prelude, let us plunge into our task. 2. In Europe during the 18th century, there had been many esoteric groups with the same basic idea. Each one wanted to become the original nucleus of an expanding secret society which would keep on growing until someday it ruled the world. Most important of these ambitious groups was the Order of the Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria on May 1, 1776. This, incidentally, is why, about 100 years later, the socialist organizations of Europe made May 1 the International Red Holiday, which it has remained to the present time. Their leaders were honoring the birthday of the whole vast conspiratorial movement of which they themselves were a part. The strategy of Weishaupt's order calls for nothing less than the destruction of all religion, of all governments, and of all previously existing human institutions. Out of the chaos, anarchy, suffering, and confusion thus to be created, the conspirators were to develop their new order. They did not mind in the least if this plan brought about a hell on earth, so long as Weishaupt and his Illuminati, or their respective successors, could wind up as its Lucifer and his court. We know that this seems hard to believe for those who have not delved into these dark caves of history. Not only are the facts fully documented and indisputable, however, but the most ample proof lies in the visible recurrence from time to time during the last 200 years of this same plan being vigorously prosecuted and its remarkable success over the past 2 generations, as we shall see in due course. So let us repeat this point for emphasis. Simply remember that the underlying, unchanging objective of the total conspiracy is to destroy all religion, all traditional forms of government, and all the organizational bases of our whole civilization. And then note how many of the sinister activities you see going on all around you are insidiously but effectively serving that purpose. The first great destructive strike of this group at the old order was the French Revolution. Their extremely foul and significant role in bringing about that Holocaust and in making it such a memorable horror have been well known to honest students of history for a long time. But the French Revolution itself proved to be premature from the ambitious point of view of the conspirators. They simply did not yet have the organizational reach and power to extend what they had created into a destructive worldwide upheaval of the same kind. A returning flood of decency, of tradition, of compassion, and of common sense soon caused the terror of the French Revolution to recede. And then, during 20 years of the Napoleonic Wars, there was, in appearance, such a gradual return to normalcy that the Allied monarchs who sent Bonaparte to exile in St. Helena restored a Bourbon to the throne of France. But under the surface, things were not what they seemed, and never would be again, at least for the next 200 years. For Weishaupt's circle of conspirators had come through the revolution more firmly entrenched than before, and with far wider reach. So much so that by 1798, only 22 years after the group had been founded, a very well-traveled and well-informed scholar named John Robison and a devoutly religious cleric, the Abbé Baruel, both wrote books to warn the world, and especially its governments, of the international power and permeation which the Illuminati already had so cunningly and so secretly achieved. Even in faraway America, their infiltration into positions of influence had become a whispered scandal. In October 1798, George Washington, in a letter to a friend, expressed his concern over the spread in the United States of the diabolical tenets of the Illuminati and the pernicious principles of Jacobinism, if, as he said, they are susceptible of separation. And a book exposing some of the ramifications of this conspiracy was published in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1802. But the secrecy of the organization was gradually becoming tighter, and although their presence could always be felt behind the scenes, the history of the group itself became more and more shadowy. We do not know for sure whether or not for a while there may have been a splintering of the oligarchy into rival conspiratorial groups, or whether, on the other hand, Weishaupt's order may have remained intact and simply have absorbed into its ranks some rival organizations which did get underway, or whether several parallel groups were eventually consolidated into one. There is no need for guessing at knowledge we do not have, because what is known is ample for our purposes. We do know, for instance, that by 1798, and from then on until 1815, the insiders of this conspiracy were establishing themselves in positions of power within the governments and the institutions on both sides of the battle lines that had been drawn by the ambition of Napoleon. This ambivalence was a cardinal policy of the early Illuminati, since it was their very purpose to destroy all governments, including their own, and replace such outdated remnants with a one-world tyranny run by themselves. All displays of patriotism on their part were but a pretense for the public and a joke among themselves. And necessarily, of course, this policy has become and remained an equally firm principle for all of their successors. We also know that by 1848, the conspiracy was cohesive enough, powerful enough, and with sufficient reach to have brought off the various revolutions and uprisings of that year almost simultaneously in several countries. And at the same time, a revolutionary action arm of the conspiracy, known as the communist movement, came out more or less openly on the scene with an announcement of its existence, its methods, and its purposes. This was done through the publication, also in 1848, of the Communist Manifesto. So far as we know, it was a group of the conspiracy calling themselves the League of Just Men, who felt the urgent need for a codification of the strategy, the tactics, and the aims that were being followed. So they commissioned a young intellectual hack named Karl Marx to prepare this synthesis for them. He did so with the help of a wealthy fellow revolutionary and close friend, Friedrich Engels. Contrary to the impression which has been so carefully created since, there was almost nothing original on the part of Marx and Engels in this document. Their names did not even appear on any printed copy of the manifesto when it first came out, or for at least 20 years thereafter. This was strictly a party platform, as Dr. Stephan Pisoni has labeled it, for the guidance of the communist movement in the future. And the total conspiracy, of which this communist movement was only one instrumentality, was even then already in the 72nd year of its satanic progress. But the communist arm was eventually to become so important a part of the total revolutionary and destructive apparatus that today it is frequently confused and equated with the body as a whole. The manifesto and the other events of 1848 did clearly mark the beginning of a new era in the history of the conspiracy. So we ourselves had better take a fresh start at this point in our study of that history. Section 3. Before we go further, therefore, it seems best to deal with some questions which may be stirring in your minds. And we'll try to save time by not only supplying answers which serve for the period we have covered, but by applying this basic clarification to all the stages of the expanding conspiracy right up to the present time. For we may thus clear the way for an easier and better understanding of many surprising developments we shall need to record. For that purpose, we need once more to go back to the beginning. Adam Weishaupt and his ablest associates not only succeeded in gathering princes and potentates and bankers and diplomats into the upper echelons of their conspiracy, but Weishaupt laid down for his fellow conspirators the policy that they should always go after the sons of the powerful, the rich, and the famous to become members of his order. And that policy has been followed faithfully ever since. It accounts for the surprising circumstance that a preponderant majority of all these power-seeking megalomaniacs in the upper echelons of the conspiracy in any country always come and still come from the very top economic, social, educational, and political circles of that country. This was true for the 70 years before the communist movement even began to take shape in the 1840s. It has remained equally true throughout all of the 125 years since that time, while the communist arm was becoming so important and useful a part of the total conspiracy. A great many members of the oligarchy have been recruited into the lower fringes of the conspiratorial apparatus, frequently while in college, without ever having gone through the communist route at all. They are taken into the broad fraternal circle because of the money or prestige or fame of their fathers or their families, and sometimes because of their own early brilliance. For with them come the basic ingredients of power, which can thus be added to the total strength and resources of the conspiracy. The result that concerns us, therefore, is that most of the really top conspirators, whom for convenience we call the insiders, have never had a Communist Party card, nor ever seen a communist cell. Many of them were originally brought into the conspiratorial clique through misguided idealism, again exactly as planned by Adam Weishaupt. But by the time they learned the whole truth about the organization of which they were a part, it was too late to get out. Also, by that time, they had been brought, through clever and continuous psychological molding, to a different outlook themselves. For the neophytes who cannot be so molded are simply dropped before they ever learn too much about the real nature of the club. Among those who do gradually climb further into the upper and inner circles of the conspiracy, however, there is no slightest trace of idealism left. Cynicism has become their religion, the pursuit of wealth or power or position has become their goal, and opportunism within the permitted boundaries has become the guide for their energies and their actions. For this conspiratorial oligarchy long ago became the greatest exemplar of the you scratch my back and I scratch yours principle of advancement that the world has ever known. Once conscience has been discarded in favor of ruthless ambition, these converts to the conspiracy have come to realize how the tremendous and pervasive influence of the insiders and now of the communist machinery which the insiders control can pave the way for their own acquisitions of more riches or fame or more prestige and success within their chosen fields. And especially does this backing provide the means of acquiring more and more power during their own lifetimes for those who want power most. All that these opportunists must offer in exchange for so much help up the ladder is unswerving support of that drive for ultimate world rule on the part of the total conspiracy which gives it direction and cohesiveness. By ruthless devotion to this central aim, the more ambitious members of the oligarchy climb into higher and tighter circles of the pyramidal structure above them as they personally grow more cunning, more hypocritical, more cold-blooded, more powerful, and more proudly conscious of the power that they possess and wield. A quick but contemporary illustration may be helpful. Friends used to say to us about Christian Herter, "Look, this man has been a congressman, then governor of Massachusetts, and finally Secretary of State. Why on earth would he want to be a communist? What would he have to gain?" To which the answer was very easy. You have the cart before the horse, my friend. It's because Christian Herter had been a member of the conspiracy and had worked for the communist cause all of his life, ever since he had been one of Colonel House's boys at the Versailles Conference, that he was helped and enabled to become a congressman, then governor, and at last a Secretary of State. This is the way the game is played, by and for the insiders. Of course, there are some of these ambitious and ruthless characters who do begin their careers as communists. These are the ones that have sufficient ability and determination and who gradually gain a sufficient grasp of the true picture to rise above their cannon fodder estate and climb into some level of the conspiratorial circles above. And of course, these few that do have what it takes are welcomed because they add strength and drive and cunning to the total force of the conspiracy. But your true insiders, whether with communist backgrounds or coming out of famous families through Ivy League colleges almost directly into the upper circles, all acquire one attitude in common. They have only contempt and a merciless scorn for the poor deluded fools who, carrying out the plans and orders of these insiders themselves, dynamite churches or burn stores or build barricades in the streets in the name of revolution. These inside masters of the game who foment, finance, control, and manipulate all of these revolutionary activities usually remain entirely aloof and above such plebeian performances. For they are well aware that communism, far from being a spontaneous uprising of the suffering masses against bosses who exploit them, is actually imposed on every country from the top down, and that all the pretense of mass uprisings and revolution has to be created artificially, especially in a country like the United States, by incessant agitation, propaganda, coercion, and cajolery. They also know that the condition of the people, both materially and spiritually, in any country where communist rule has been established, is always worse than it was before. But this is of no concern to the insiders. Their only goal and interest is power for themselves at any price. As reluctant as we are to mention names, it will certainly clarify the picture if we cite a few examples of contemporary figures whom we believe to be insiders, or to have been insiders while they were alive. We would apply this description without hesitation, for instance, to John Foster Dulles, Christian Herder, Nelson Rockefeller, Henry Ford II, and Henry Cabot Lodge. We believe it is extremely unlikely that any of these men ever had a Communist Party card, or attended a communist cell meeting, or considered himself to be a communist. Yet in every case, the record is absolutely clear and can be documented beyond all room for doubt that each of these men has worked, or did work, steadily, cunningly, and ruthlessly for the communist cause during all of his adult career. Just as their earlier prototypes in the conspiracy, 150 years ago, before the communist movement was inaugurated, worked steadily to promote the cause of revolutionary destructiveness without soiling their own hands in the riots and the massacres. This has been the story ever since the formula was established by Adam Weishaupt. It has explained the motivation and the actions of the top-level individual conspirators from the French Revolution days of such incredibly foul members of the Illuminati as Mirabeau and the Duke of Orleans, right up to the even more merciless drives for power of Robert Strange McNamara and Milton Eisenhower. So let's go back now to the point where we interrupted our chronological sequence and outlined the advance of the conspiracy after 1848, during those decades when the communist movement was still only one division of the army which was attacking all the bastions of civilization. For during the latter half of the 19th century, the inner circle of this total conspiracy set up or took over, guided and worked through many subversive groups and organizations of many kinds all over Europe and America. These groups were busily engaged in promoting riots, revolution, class hatred, bitterness between all natural divisions of the human race, socialist legislation, collectivist propaganda, and in all of the activities which today we ascribe to the worldwide communist parties. But in those days, the communist movement had not yet become even the most important instrumentality of the conspiracy, and much less something to be mistakenly equated with it. These agencies of destruction included the anarchists, the nihilists, the syndicalists of various shades, and several others, besides, of course, the communists themselves. They varied in makeup and method, from the revived Carbonari, used by Albert Pike and Garibaldi and Mazzini as revolutionary guerrillas and stormtroops, to the oh-so-learned professors like Adolf Wagner, who started Germany down the road to socialism under Bismarck, and the oh-so-socially acceptable Fabian Society in England. Each of them appeared to be independently following its own path of crime or pressure or propaganda, while actually each of them was carrying out some divisional task for the destruction of the entire old order of civilization, even though most of the members of some of these groups had no more idea of what they were really about than do the misguided idealists today who have been beguiled into supporting the so-called civil rights movement. Wherever you might have dug deeply enough under the surface of all the criminal turmoil and collectivist indoctrination during the half-century after 1848, you would have found the brains and the hands of the Illuminati insiders fomenting and guiding all of these activities which benefited their long-range program. If all of this, too, seems hard to believe, let's pause long enough to look at just one revealing and convincing illustration out of dozens that are available. And we'll bring the whole matter closer home by taking the Haymarket riot in Chicago, right here in our own country, in 1888, for our example. In planning, in execution, and in purpose, it was very little different from the siege of the Bastille in France in 1789, or the attack on the police at the Democratic Convention in the United States in 1968. And they were all carried out by identically the same incredibly ruthless and destructive conspiracy. In this Haymarket affair, the police, being convinced after showing great patience that a mob of anarchists was being excited to an incendiary pitch, ordered the crowd to disperse. Instead, one member of the mob hurled a dynamite bomb with fuse burning into the ranks of the police. As a result of the explosion, and of the gun battle which then followed, 8 policemen were killed and 67 wounded. In general, the sinister international planning behind all such tragedies was completely ignored, and the riots themselves were accepted by press and people as simply sporadic outbreaks of criminally minded malcontents. We have exactly the same situation today when the riots on our campuses are described by Richard Nixon, Edward Kennedy, and many other political leaders as separate and spontaneous manifestations of the natural rebelliousness of youth without any central planning or agitation behind them, despite all the mountains of evidence to the contrary. But fortunately, after the Haymarket horror, Captain Michael J. Shark of the Chicago Police felt it was his duty to dig into every aspect of the tragedy which had killed and maimed so many of his fellow officers. After a year of very careful and extensive investigation, Captain Shark produced a monumental work published in 1889 under the title of Anarchy and Anarchists. The book runs to nearly 700 large printed pages and brings out with tremendous detail and documentation the sinister international planning, backing, and organization behind these murderous anarchists in just one American city. And we think it is worthwhile for us to quote a few extracts from the final pages of that magnificent study. Quote, "All over the world, the apostles of disorder, rapine, and anarchy are today pressing forward their work of ruin and preaching their gospel of disaster to all the nations with a more fiery energy and a better organized propaganda than was ever known before. People who imagine that the energy of the revolutionists has slackened, or that their determination to wreck all the existing systems has grown less bitter, are deceiving themselves." Parenthetically, please note that phrase, their determination to wreck all the existing systems. Captain Shark had uncovered the goal of the insiders who ran this total conspiracy, to which all the efforts and activities of all their dupes and agents everywhere were unwaveringly directed. Let's go back, however, to Shark's book, published in 1889. He continues as follows, quote, "The conspiracy against society is as determined as it ever was, and among every nation, the spirit of revolt is being galvanized into a newer and more dangerous life. In Europe, the same ferment is apparent. In England, the conspiracy is still largely undercover, but the propaganda is busy, and occasional rumblings may be heard of the work going on underground. The conspirators, safely covered by the fancied security of the people, are permitted to undermine at their will the fabric of English society. In France, the Commune is stronger than it ever was, and the Red Terror may appear with every turn of the whirligig of politics. In Spain and Italy, and especially in the smaller states, the socialists are busy, while in Germany and in Russia, a crisis is at hand. Thus, the world over, governments are menaced with a danger before which foreign war is as nothing." Again, parenthetically, please note this next sentence. Quote, "Nothing but the uprooting of the very foundations and groundwork of our civilization will satisfy these enemies of order. Let none mistake either the purpose or the devotion of these fanatics, nor their growing strength. This is methodic, not a haphazard conspiracy. The ferment in Russia is controlled by the same heads and the same hands as the activity in Chicago. There is a cold-blooded, calculating purpose behind this revolt, manipulating every part of it the world over to a common and ruinous end." That's the end of the quotation. Now this, my friends, was a warning to the people of the United States in 1889, almost identical with the warning of John Robison to the governments of Europe in 1798, and, let us repeat, it was about identically the same continuing conspiracy. It is the same warning which we, in the John Birch Society, have been proclaiming to our fellow citizens for years. The communist movement has now largely swallowed the nihilists, the anarchists, and such other raw instrumentalities of the overall command. But this whole combination of destructive forces is still being run by the same self-perpetuating international clique of usually silk-hatted and always power-hungry criminals which has been undermining our civilization for almost 200 years. After 1848 and throughout the 19th century, the inner circle steadily tightened its organization of the total oligarchy and consolidated its control over subsidiary, affiliated, or independent revolutionary groups. It achieved ever more effective secrecy about its existence, its membership, and its activities. And its secret power grew by leaps and bounds, so that by around 1900, these insiders had already come to exercise tremendously subversive influence within practically all the governments of Europe, as well as the United States. And the separate thrusts of this influence were brilliantly meshed and coordinated by some central command, with more and more palpable results which formed a new chapter for the conspiracy and now deserve one from ourselves. Section 4. Far as the 20th century got underway, various parts of the great destructive plan began to materialize. The secret intrigues and activities of the insiders, already spreading like a vast poisonous vine throughout all governments and all human institutions, began increasingly to implant and to develop malignant weaknesses in the whole body of the civilized world. Insidious changes in the economic systems of the productive nations, revolutions and civil wars, and even world wars now began to take place, not haphazardly or fortuitously, but all in due and measured sequence, according to one careful and comprehensive design. For these great tragic developments were all simply logical and confident steps in the strategy of the conspiracy. In the United States, in the first 2 decades of this century, these secret influences were accomplishing wonders for their evil cause without the American people having the slightest suspicion of what was taking place. The same forces that brought Woodrow Wilson and Edward Mandell House to power also instituted the graduated income tax and established the Federal Reserve System. This was strictly according to Project Number 2 and Project Number 5 in the program set forth by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto for the destruction of capitalistic nations. They put through the 17th Amendment for the direct election of United States senators as the first great legalistic step in the planned change of our republic into a democracy. They established the tax-exempt foundation system, which would eventually put billions of dollars of liquid funds into the hands of insiders who would use the money to promote subversion and revolution. They provided midwives for the birth of many national organizations, such as the Federal Council of Churches, the NAACP, and the ADL, which would be so useful to them a generation later. Far more important than any of these accomplishments, however, in this or any other country, was their incitement of World War I. This was the most completely senseless and unjustified war in the history of mankind. There was no sound or legitimate reason for any of the nations involved to be in this war, and least of all for the United States. The whole thing had to be artificially and synthetically contrived by intrigues and pressures and propaganda designed exactly for that purpose. This horror was deliberately and cunningly inflicted on the human race by the insiders of the great conspiracy, for it was a tremendous step in carrying forward their satanic program, and the war became the means and supplied the opportunity for terrifically far-reaching destruction of the old order, exactly as had been planned. It was the First World War which undermined the Tsar's government and created so much chaos in Russia, even before it was over, that enabled Lenin and Trotsky to seize control. They were financed, it is worth noting, from Germany and the United States by insiders in both countries who were supposed to be at war with each other. But actually, they were only at war against civilization. And without the continuous help of these bosses of the conspiracy, with their influence in the capitals of Europe and in New York and Washington, Lenin's communist regime would have had no chance of survival in Russia throughout its early years. It was the First World War, fought under the revealing slogan to make the world safe for democracy, that put such immense power into the hands of the then top American insider, Colonel Edward Mandell House. This was power which enabled House, with his fellow insiders from other countries at the Versailles Conference, and with the help of his brain trust of young would-be insiders consisting of John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Christian Herter, Walter Lippmann, and Norman Thomas, to carry out plans which would make it possible for the same conspiracy, and to some extent the same conspirators, to bring on a second World War just 20 years later. It was World War I which destroyed America's wise and proud independence of the old world squabbles, which wrought such great psychological changes in the outlook of the American people, and which carried the people of both Europe and America a huge step towards the one world concept that was so immensely important to the conspiracy. And it was all the excitement and action and propaganda connected with the war which enabled the communists and the insiders to increase their strength and their reach many-fold in the 10 years from 1912 to 1922. In fact, by 1922, the secret levers of power within the United States were already being grasped by the conspirators to an alarming extent, without the people, or even most of the honorable men in government, having any real understanding of what had taken place. By that year, quite a number of comparatively new organizations, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, the League for Industrial Democracy, the Friends of Soviet Russia, the American Jewish Committee, and the Rand School for Social Science, had already earned the right to be described as communist fronts. And it would have greatly surprised most Americans, busy with their commercial and professional careers and happy with their so-called return to normalcy under the Harding administration, to realize how many of their prominent fellow citizens were already busily engaged in actions or propaganda which helped the communist advance, and how many of them, in fact, had become prominent primarily because they were so engaged and had thus been given the benefit of all the helpful publicity and favorable treatment which the well-directed apparatus could put behind them. Such a list of active protégés and supporters of the communist movement as early as 1922 would have included Newton D. Baker, Jane Addams, Charles P. Steinmetz, Sidney Hillman, Norman Thomas, Walter Lippmann, Christian Herter, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Felix Warburg, Haywood Broun, Carrie Chapman Catt, Charlie Chaplin, Jacob Schiff, Stuart Chase, Scott Nearing, Amos Pinchot, Felix Frankfurter, William C. Bullitt, Upton Close, Bishop William Montgomery Brown, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, Reverend Harry F. Ward, Lincoln Steffens, Upton Sinclair, Harry Laidlaw, John Dewey, Rexford Tugwell, Jack London, Carl Van Doren, William Allen White, Theodore Dreiser, Paul H. Douglas, Zona Gale, and hundreds more. The agitation and propaganda stage of revolutionary activities within the United States, the communists call it agitprop, was well underway. That was over 45 years ago, and the combined power of the insiders, their communist stooges, and the communist fellow travelers, when thrown with full force into any one undertaking, was fully revealed for the first time in what happened to the Harding administration. Harding had been elected president by the wave of revulsion among the American people against involvement in foreign war, against the plan to involve them further in the intrigues and troubles of the whole world through the League of Nations, and against the steady movement towards socialism right here at home. The insiders and their agents had not been able to prevent that return to normalcy, but they were determined to make the setback as temporary as possible. For despite this necessity of rolling with the punch, they were still very conscious of all the muscle they had acquired during the World War years. So, when Harry M. Doherty, who was certainly one of the best attorney generals the United States has ever had, raided the secret and illegal Communist Convention in Bridgman, Michigan in 1922, and later in the same year took steps to stop the incredibly brazen crimes and defiance of law which revolutionary radicals had injected into the great railroad strike, he immediately became the target of a smear campaign unparalleled in previous American history. This monumental and ruthless combination of frame-up, falsehoods, and distortions was soon turned on the Harding administration as a whole. The conspiratorial nature of this all-out attack was so little understood or even suspected by the American people that the reputations of some very able, honorable, and patriotic men, and especially of Harry Doherty and of Harding himself, have remained clouded by it to this day. Exactly the same kind of concerted and continuous smear campaign that had destroyed a king and queen of France 4 generations earlier had now proved its effectiveness in the United States for repeated use on future occasions. It was to be applied in all-out fashion 30 years later to the destruction of Senator Joseph McCarthy, and 40 years later it was to be applied with even more comprehensive and continuous efforts to that attempted undermining and destruction of the John Birch Society, which undermining still continues unabated and with amazing variety and viciousness. We shall now have to telescope some of this history into even smaller proportions. But fortunately, most of it from here on is better understood. The stock market crash in the fall of 1929 and the depression that followed were used by the communists to weaken the faith of the American people in our free enterprise system and to prepare the way for government intervention on a massive scale. And with the inauguration of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932, a whole new phase began of more rapid progress by the conspirators towards their ultimate goal. The communist regime in Russia was saved from collapse through the prestige and credit accruing to it from the official recognition by our government. This opened the gates at once for a constant stream of communist agents and spies to enter our country and to begin to entrench themselves in jobs within our federal bureaucracy as well as in every other division of our national life. The banks were all closed together by government decree and then reopened separately by government permission to show us how we had to be protected by our government from the follies and wickedness of private business. And our money was taken off the gold standard domestically and its intrinsic value arbitrarily changed by the criminal action of Roosevelt's administration as the first long step toward the intended future condition when it would become only fiat money altogether. Pigs were killed and crops were plowed under, public boondoggles were begun on a massive scale, and government direction and controls were introduced into every part of our economy to get the people to believe and accept the thesis that government had to and was able to provide for their welfare. And by 1939, a depression which normally would have been completely over and forgotten in 5 years had been kept in effect for 10 years by all of these government interferences with the normal working of the American system. What's more, it had all been planned that way. But by 1937, the insiders of the world were ready, and Stalin was ready in Russia to bring on their Second World War. The first steps in the United States to that end began with Roosevelt's quarantine speech, which exactly reversed what had supposedly been our foreign policy during those years of interlude when the communists were making their necessary hay on the domestic scene. Now, gradually but rapidly, all the artifices of worldwide intrigue were applied and all the stops were pulled out in the organs of propaganda to get this war underway and then to push us into it as rapidly as possible. When even these gigantic efforts proved inadequate or too slow, Stalin precipitated the war in Europe by his devious and temporary alliance with Hitler for the invasion of Poland. In due course, Franklin Roosevelt and George Marshall harried and enticed the Japanese into attacking us at Pearl Harbor. And thus, World War II began the new, tremendously further developed phase of the conspiracy's advance for which the war had been planned. This advance was on all fronts. Within the United States, the spending and taxes that could be instituted and the controls and powers that could be exercised by a government engaged in a full-scale world war made actions of the same kind for which the Depression had served as an excuse look like merely weak rehearsals by children at play. Even more important, however, was the fact that this war officially made the communists the allies of so many of the leading nations of the world. Under these circumstances, the insiders and the communists rapidly maneuvered themselves into such effective control almost everywhere that the whole war was fought, especially by the United States, and tactically as well as strategically, with aid to the imperialistic designs of the communists as the objective overriding all others. This Second World War, with its immense psychological as well as sociological impact, carried the disruption and destruction of the old order of civilization tremendously further than any depths which had been reached before. It prepared the way for that steady undermining and disintegration of all the traditional and humane elements of the old order which have continued ever since. And more specifically, this war and its aftermath provided the chaos and confusion and suffering and despair in Eastern and Central Europe and in Eastern Asia, which gave the communists the opportunity for all of their conquests that followed. And finally, all of the circumstances and propaganda accompanying World War II enabled the communists to bring about one result of greater value to their plans than any of the others we have listed. For communism is truly international. The subjugation of any one country by the communists is always aided by, or even the direct result of, international conniving. And the very sad but incontrovertible and fully proved fact, my friends, is that since 1940, the most important and powerful single force in carrying forward the communist advance all over the world has been the United States government. The activist groups within each country that gradually took over that country were usually directed from Moscow. But the money and prestige and economic help and diplomatic pressures that made each attempted subjugation successful were largely supplied from Washington. If this shocks you, stop and think about the actual and known history in each case. Poland was not lost to the communists during 1945 to 1947 in Warsaw, even though the Lublin gang of communist traitors there supplied the framework for the takeover. Poland was lost in Washington by the help of our government to the Lublin gang, as arranged and carried out by Dean Acheson. The whole horrible story is told and fully documented in I Saw Poland Betrayed by Arthur Bliss Lane, our ambassador to Poland at the time, a book which cost him his career and eventually his life. Algeria was not lost to the communists in Algeria or even in Paris. The long and cruel terror of the activist FLN and the cunning betrayal of his own country by the incredibly ruthless Charles de Gaulle were vital to this development, of course. But the pro-communist drive and prestige which gave the FLN guerrilla massacres the status of a civil war, and which enabled de Gaulle to carry out his treason at Evian, had long been supplied from Washington, primarily through the efforts of Henry Cabot Lodge and the then Senator John F. Kennedy. And that record, too, is as clear as day. China was not lost in Chongqing, Canton, or Shanghai, but in Washington, through the unceasing help to Mao Zedong and the undermining of Chiang Kai-shek by General George Marshall in our State Department. There were a dozen books which laid this on the line right while it was happening, but they were all smothered so that the American people would not know the truth. And you can find the record of that smothering and its results in just one small book, While You Slept, by John T. Flynn. Cuba was not lost in Havana, but again by the deliberate actions of our government in Washington. Castro's guerrillas supplied the framework for the takeover, but it was the unceasing help to Castro and undermining of Batista by Milton Eisenhower, Christian Herter, and the whole Eisenhower administration which brought Castro to power and which kept him there during those touch-and-go early years. Again, that record has been made clear by, among others, our former ambassador to Cuba, who saw the betrayal taking place. And the same story, with very little change in its broad outline, has been true and has been amply proved in books you were never given a chance to read, in the case of almost every territorial advance the communists have ever made. Let us incorporate into our story at this point, therefore, a brief review of their geographical progress during the last 50 years, for the open record of this success is a central fact of our contemporary history. That record began in 1917, when Lenin was able, with Trotsky and only a few hundred followers, to take the Russian Revolution out of the hands of its earlier leaders and convert it into a communist strike for power. Then, by the use of almost incredible audacity and terror, they seized control of Russia itself. In 1918, these communist usurpers established some degree of stability and recognition for their regime by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, and by 1922 they had extended their infiltration, terror, and control enough to set up the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The communists were able to bring into this USSR, besides the greatly reduced Russia proper left them at the time of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, the further areas of Russian Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And with this combination as a base, Lenin and his successors, notably Stalin, set out patiently and resolutely to conquer the world. For reasons too involved for us to go into them here, the strategy for this global conquest was laid down by Lenin in advice which has been summarized and paraphrased as follows. First, we will take Eastern Europe. Next, the masses of Asia. Then we shall encircle that last bastion of capitalism, the United States of America. We shall not have to attack. It will fall like overripe fruit into our hands. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the communists have never wavered from that three-step strategy one iota, nor from any part of it, nor from the methods by which this advance was to be carried out. For Lenin was not thinking or talking about conquering all of these other nations in due course by communist military might, any more than Russia itself had been taken by such means. He was referring to the eventual seizure of power in one country after another through infiltration, subversion, and propaganda, through creating a civil war, or at least the semblance of civil war, within each target country, and by all of the diplomatic, economic, political, and coercive pressures that could then be exercised against the legitimate government of each intended victim by communist agents and allies in the leading capitals of the world. From 1922 to 1939, however, most of the energy, cunning, and cruelty of the conspiracy was spent on strengthening its position of infiltration and influence within various countries, including the United States, rather than in actual efforts to take them over. Only in China and in Spain were such efforts made, and even these appear to have been largely premature and preparatory for the global conquests to be undertaken later. But World War II completed all of these preparations. With the help of the conditions created by that war, which we have already mentioned, and with the unceasing aid of the American government to the Soviets throughout that war and during the years immediately after it, Stalin moved fast and far ahead according to the blueprint laid out by Lenin. By 1948, the Soviets had imposed their brutal communist tyranny over Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Albania, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. The communists now had Eastern Europe entire, and the first step of their program was complete. But they had also begun their revolutionary activities in Asia very early, and again with the vital help of our government at every turn, they were carrying out their second step only a short distance behind the first one. So that by 1950, the Soviets had established communist satellite regimes in Mongolia, in North Korea, in Manchuria, and over all of the mainland of China. Their conquest of the masses of Asia by repeated application of the same formula, composed of cunning, terror, and American support, has continued steadily ever since. In 1945, for instance, an Asiatic communist named Ho Chi Minh, who had been trained in Moscow, was set up in business as a communist revolutionary in Indochina with our money, our equipment, and our moral support. By 1954, with the direct on-the-scenes help of the American Colonel Edward Lansdale and of our State Department, Ho Chi Minh and other agents of the Kremlin succeeded in throwing the French out of Vietnam and in taking over the better half of that domain for themselves. By 1956, Stalin's murderous agent, Ahmed Sukarno, was being royally welcomed and glorified in Washington as the ruler of Indonesia. And so the story went, until you will find that today the de facto control by the communists of all of Asia is virtually complete. The second step of their global strategy has been accomplished. And of course the communists have been moving steadily forward on their third step, especially since about 1950. The surrounding of the United States, as they put it, involves their establishing practical control of Western Europe. This has already gone so far today, with the governments of England and of France having been in communist hands for years, that even the government of West Germany is now dominated by communist influences almost as much as is our own. And even the strength of Franco's government in Spain is being undermined by, of all things, pro-communist liberal movements within the Catholic Church. This surrounding process involves the taking over by the communists of the northern ledge of Africa, and then all of that continent. It involves the establishment of communist or crypto-communist regimes in Canada and in all of Latin America. In that connection, it is worth noting that since 1945, Nelson Rockefeller, Milton Eisenhower, John Kennedy with his so-called Alliance for Progress, and other molders and executors of our State Department policy have contrived to have billions of dollars of American taxpayers' money spent in Latin America to promote the political fortunes of those regimes and those demagogues that were pro-communist, while always leaving the anti-communists, so far as possible, holding empty bags. It is worth noting more specifically that, as a part of this strategy of encirclement, Cuba was made a very strong communist outpost. The strongly anti-communist government of the Dominican Republic was destroyed, and the lifelong communist Romulo Betancourt was brought back to power in Venezuela, all primarily through the direct efforts and conniving of the Eisenhower administration. And that right while these pages are being written in the spring of 1969, the present administration in Washington is using its full prestige and power to help a communist group to establish its rule over Peru. It has been the aim of the communists to achieve virtual control of the Western Hemisphere, except for the people of the United States, before closing in on this final bastion of capitalism. Simultaneously, World War II and its aftermath had given birth to the means and procedures whereby the insiders and their communist agents during the next 25 years have been establishing themselves in virtual control over almost all of the governments of the world. This has left them only one major task still to be carried out. This is to weave the almost infinite lines of their influence and power in the United States into such a straitjacket over the total body of the American people that effective resistance is no longer possible. And we shall devote the rest of this historical survey to the strategy and tactics by which they have been carrying out that task. Section 5. Several observations of a general nature seem to be in order at this point. The first is that, purely for convenience, in this second part of our story, we can usually let the communist arm that has grown so strong represent the whole conspiratorial body and simply refer, as a rule, to the communist conspiracy, although there are places where the inaccuracy of this description must be kept in mind. Second, we are now in the last stage of the struggle, my friends, and make no mistake about it. An international conspiracy which has been continuous, patient, cold-blooded, and single-minded for 6 generations, and phenomenally successful in moving toward its ultimate goal during the last 2 generations, is now confident that its final victory is close at hand. And these conspirators intend to leave nothing to chance. There is almost no limit, therefore, to the variety, the extensiveness, or the ruthless cunning of the plans, measures, and means by which they have been proceeding on their ruthless course. Third, since we cannot begin to offer a complete panoramic survey of all of these activities, we shall have to be selective and look at some 8 divisions of the communist strategy by which they have expected, quite literally, to fasten on the American people the chains of slavery. And fourth, let us make clear that from the very beginning, 200 years ago, the insiders who control this conspiracy have always counted on 3 basic means for carrying out their program. These are 1, war, 2, money, and 3, hatred. You will find one or more of these tools being utilized in every campaign of destructiveness which we might examine. But let's begin with the 3 long-range undertakings of the communists, in which each of these tools has been, respectively, the very core of their strategy. The first of these sinister schemes is to keep the American people almost perpetually involved in war, while the communists themselves always pretend to be seeking peace. It was only 5 years after the end of World War II, for instance, when we were dragged into the artfully contrived Korean affair, and the actual purposes of that involvement can be most easily realized by looking at some of its results. Eisenhower was inaugurated in January 1953. Up to May of that year, our generals in Korea were still in position to win that war quickly, decisively, and overwhelmingly. Even so careful and able a man as General Van Fleet later went on record with a public statement to that effect. Instead, Eisenhower terminated the war by the most ignominious negotiations in our nation's history, gave up entirely every purpose for which the war had supposedly been fought, and let our country betray both our South Korean allies and our own soldiers who had died fighting in a war which they were kept from winning only by orders from Washington. We left South Korea as living proof of the devastation that would be wreaked on any country which depended on the United States to save it from communism. We broke our word in the most flagrant and cruel manner to tens of thousands of Chinese and North Korean prisoners who, having been impressed into the communist armies against their will, had risked their lives to come over to our side in reliance on our promises to protect them. We left untold hundreds of our own men as helpless prisoners in the hands of their communist enemies. We reduced the prestige and moral leadership of the United States to the lowest point it had ever reached up to that time, and we gave the communists in Asia their greatest boost since our government had helped and enabled them to take over the mainland of China. All of which may help you to a better understanding of the second performance of this same show, which has been taking place in Vietnam. History not only repeats itself, but sometimes the repetition is actually planned by evil men many years in advance. There is plenty of evidence that the basic plot of the Vietnam drama, exactly as it has been acted out over the past 17 years, was carefully planned by the insiders at least as far back as 1952. There are countless ways in which our involvement in Vietnam has been used to help the communists in Europe as well as in Asia. But its effect on our domestic affairs has been of even greater benefit to the communist program. And we repeat that involvement of the United States in unceasing wars, of which the communists control both sides, has been a vital part of the communist design. The primary objective of the forces that dominate our government in being at war in Southeastern Asia or anywhere else is simply to be at war. And far from ever having wanted to win the war in Vietnam, our government has gone to tremendous lengths, both by advanced planning and in its actual conduct of the war, to give our failure to win it as much plausibility as possible. Let's look at a few facts and arguments which support these assertions. In the first place, if our objective was to save some people from communist terror and tyranny, then why not Cuba? Why did we go halfway around the world instead to fight the communists on behalf of some other small country, except to make our own difficulties in conducting the war immensely greater and more expensive? But further questions just pour out, one on top of another. Why did we spend many years in subtly destroying so many of the real anti-communist forces and leaders in South Vietnam before getting this war underway, with ourselves directly involved, except to make it that much harder for our armed forces to win. With the communists advancing all over the world, why did we choose to fight them in the one place and manner where, as General MacArthur pointed out, the odds were the heaviest against us, namely with ground forces on the mainland of Asia, except, of course, to make a protracted struggle and our failure to win it seem more plausible? Why has our government refused to let our military forces bomb Haiphong Harbor and thus put our enemies out of business for lack of equipment? Why has our government, by massive aid to the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, made it possible for these supplies to be sent to Haiphong in the first place? The answer is very simple. It's because our government has been doing everything it dared do to enable our communist enemies to uphold and carry on their side of the war. On the island of Taiwan today, there are over 500,000 well-trained, well-armed Chinese soldiers whose whole object in life is to fight the communists on the mainland of Asia. The head of their government, Chiang Kai-shek, has begged to be allowed to send them into the war in Vietnam on our side. Not only has he been emphatically denied the opportunity to do so, but it has been made clear to him that he would be prevented by force, if necessary, from carrying out any effort to fight our enemies in Asia. Why? All of the reasons given by spokesmen for our government were easily shown to be as phony as a $3 bill. The only real reason was that, with Chiang's troops on the scene in Vietnam, it would have been almost impossible to keep our armed forces, with such allies, from going ahead and winning the war, which is the last thing Washington wanted. For the actual objective of our involvement in Southeast Asia has not been to protect South Vietnam, but to help the international conspiracy to impose its communist rule on the American people here at home. Even at the cost of laborious repetition, let's summarize briefly just how it has served and still serves this purpose. A. War always brings more and more spending. The importance of this effect becomes obvious when you realize the amount of effort carried out in Washington trying to devise plausible ways to waste American money. That statement may shock you as much now as it shocked me 20 years ago to discover the fact to be true, and even to have bureaucrats confess to me that this was what they were doing. It is not easy to bankrupt a nation with as great a productive capacity as the United States, although several insiders within the last 5 administrations, such as Dean Acheson and Robert Strange McNamara, have made great contributions to that effort. Our involvement in the Korean War and the Vietnamese War, all of the tremendously publicized threats of nuclear war, and all of the fictitious pretenses about the military might of Soviet Russia and of Red China, have provided the most useful excuses and opportunities for pouring untold billions of dollars down the drain in a constant stream. B. War also brings bigger and bigger deficits, higher and higher taxes, and more government controls over commerce and industry. These all follow naturally and easily on the heels of wartime spending. They are made more palatable by wartime psychology, especially when new tax measures are presented with the usual falsehoods about them being temporary and only for the duration of the war. A temporary tax, of course, is like a patriotic communist. It is purely a figment of the imagination. C. The Vietnamese War has been cleverly used by the insiders to help them to destroy patriotism. In the way the war has been conducted, in the obvious lack of any desire to win it, in the loss of American lives and the disruption of American life for visibly phony reasons, in the permitted and actually encouraged sedition right here at home by the very enemies our sons are fighting in Asia, in the constant and massive flood of aid by our government to our communist enemies in Europe, in all of these developments, we have the stench of deliberate and blatant treason. And this odor is so strong in the very top circles of our national life that real patriotism is being undermined and replaced by the same doubts, confusion, and despair which are eroding all other American virtues that once were commonplace. Let us emphasize again, as something for you to keep in mind throughout this whole discussion, that all the plans and activities of the conspiracy are aimed at destruction of the old order. while they are gathering into their hands the lines of power with which their new order can be established. And a war comes in very handy as a help to that undertaking. Section 6. A second division of communist strategy, now applied to the United States as to many other countries before it, has been promotion of the prospect, the semblance, and the terror of civil war here at home. This has been accomplished by lying propaganda and ruthless agitation in the name of civil rights and by the completely phony war on poverty. Manifestations of this whole design include the following. A. The civil rights movement has been loaded from top to bottom with communists, criminals, and self-proclaimed revolutionaries. Yet almost all of them have been supported morally, physically, and financially by agencies of our government, by great church and educational organizations, and by individuals in high places who are supposed to be eminently respectable. The last three administrations have played the leading role in creating the means and the excuses for civil riots. Representatives of the clergy, both Catholic and Protestant, have condoned, encouraged, and even personally led agitation and lawlessness which were visibly parts of communist-planned and communist-controlled revolutionary movements. And Nelson Rockefeller, perennial governor of our most populous state and perennial candidate for president of the United States, was one of the heaviest financial backers of Martin Luther King, whose every action was designed to advance the communist program. D. Support of the so-called war on poverty by the same influences has been even more brazen. Rioting under this banner has been encouraged, subsidized, or actually fomented by agencies of the vast federal bureaucratic monstrosity called the Office of Economic Opportunity. But in this area also, the government's agents have had plenty of help from the private subsidizers of subversion. On July 1, 1968, the Ford Foundation gave $630,000 to an officially identified communist named Maclovio Barraza for revolutionary agitation among the ordinarily loyal and peaceful Mexican Americans in our southwestern states. And this was not even unusual enough among similar actions by the Ford, Rockefeller, and other foundations to attract any appreciable attention. While for support of the same sinister activities by highly placed individuals, you do not need to look any further than the Democratic National Convention of 1968. C. A third important part of this Civil War business has been the movement to discredit, demoralize, subvert, and either destroy or absorb into a national Gestapo the local police forces of our nation. For these local police forces, if not rendered ineffective by pressures, influences, or orders from above their ranks, are both able and willing to make abortive nonsense out of any civil war, reasonable facsimile, or separate fraction thereof, which the communist agitators might try to get underway. What's more, they know the local criminals, can recognize professional goons and agitators from the outside, and, like our men in Vietnam, all they have needed to win this war with our communist enemies was for us to take off the wraps and let them perform their duties in Vietnam as soldiers and here at home as policemen. And, of course, it's the same war. But the communists have known all of this far better than the American people. So the effort to undermine our local police forces began many years ago. A major propaganda weapon of this undertaking was the charge of police brutality, which every communist was taught to shout at every feasible opportunity without the slightest regard for whether there was any truth behind it. A major action weapon of the same campaign was the formation of civilian police review boards, whereby a combination of comsimps, soft-headed sob-sisters, and political opportunists could harass and frighten the members of local police forces to the point of greatly reducing their courage, their determination to enforce the law, and their general effectiveness. These deep-laid plans have not been fully successful, however, due in large part to our own extensive campaign of recent years under the slogan, "Support your local police." But the communists never let up. So now you see three new steps in the picture. And the first is simply a growing attempt to establish the equivalent of civilian police review boards under other names and various pretenses. Second, you find that governors like Rockefeller and Romney, and mayors like Lindsay of New York and Kavanaugh of Detroit, have used their full power and influence whenever necessary, and as far as they dared, to impose stultifying orders or pressures from above on the police forces of cities within their respective jurisdictions as a means of preventing the police from making early arrests of communist-controlled agitators who were inciting mobs to arson, vandalism, and murder. Third, the federal government has now stepped in behind the communist long-range plans with regard to our local police forces with very much the same strategy by which the same federal government has gradually, in blatant violation of the United States Constitution, seized control for the communists of American public education. The core of this strategy consists of grants in aid, whereby the police themselves are beguiled by actual or prospective increases in pay and by other expected perquisites into going along with various federally dominated training programs. Out of this strategy, there evolved massive measures of the federal government for gradually establishing lines of federal authority over local police forces, for gradually brainwashing the police themselves, and for creating a situation in which resistance to the trend begins to seem futile, while opportunistic acceptance of the whole scheme becomes more and more rewarding. At the present rate of this development, it will not be long now before bureaucrats in Washington will be deciding that some police sergeant in East Overshoe may not be promoted to lieutenant because he showed too much zeal and sense of duty in stopping communist-led mobs from looting and burning his town. The government has a right to control what it subsidizes, you understand, because the Supreme Court has said so. And this steady seizure of control by the federal government, and hence by the insiders within it, over our local police forces is all just another part of the total communist plan. Section 7. We have already touched in passing on the communists' use of money to serve their satanic purposes. But we need to round this topic out a bit. And our main point is that the insiders have always had oceans of it to support their revolutionary aims and activities because they have always gone to such pains to bring men with money into their fold. They have also taken many brilliant steps, not only to get more and more money into their own hands or under their control, but to reduce the supply available to their non-communist enemies. For one illustration, the Federal Reserve System was brought into our economic milieu with brilliant foresight, along with other Marxist measures which accompanied the rise to power of Wilson and House. For decades, the Federal Reserve System was run by good men and able men in what they believed to be for the very best interests of our country, which was exactly as the communists had intended, until the time should come when a fully accepted and highly esteemed American institution could then be used to serve the many Marxist purposes for which it had been designed. One of the most important of those purposes has been that very debauchery of a nation's currency, which Lenin himself said was essential to communist plans. But that is only a part of the picture. For central banking, as represented in fact by the Federal Reserve System, actually gives the central government complete control over both the money and the credit of the whole American economic system. And hence, it has put this mighty power directly into the hands of the insiders who have been and are using it in many ways to destroy the old order. Since we cannot cover the whole waterfront in this area, however, let us jump to another outstanding example which clearly reveals the depth and brilliance of the conspiratorial plans with regard to money. For lack of a better name, we call it the foundation system. It had already been set in motion before the enabling legislation for the graduated income tax was adopted. And who was there to realize over 50 years ago that the foundation system and the income tax were but two sides of the same coin? So today, these great tax-free foundations readily provide the means and methods for the insiders to accumulate untold in liquid funds to be used to foment revolution and to promote communist purposes. And this is at the very same time, of course, that confiscatory taxes are stripping all outsiders and almost everybody who would like to support, defend, and maintain the American system of the money with which to carry on the fight. And if you do not think that Nelson Rockefeller or Henry Ford II can use the billions in the respective foundations which bear their family names exactly as freely for their own pro-communist purposes as if the money were in their private bank accounts, then just study what they have actually and already been doing with that money, and you will surely be convinced. Section 8. The third great basis of the communist advance has been their creation, use, and exploitation of hatred. They seize upon every natural or traditional division among mankind over religion, race, color, language, or class as a source of hatred on which they can capitalize. They use every conceivable form of plotting and trickery to deepen and widen these original or latent rifts. Especially right here in our own country, do they fan into larger flames all tiny sparks of bitterness they can find or can foment between Jew and Gentile, between Catholics and Protestants, between labor and management, between whites and blacks, and even between youth and age. This is in order to make the situations which they thus create serve communist purposes of turmoil and destruction. The hatred, or supposed hatred, or whatever semblance or minute substance of hatred which the communist agitators could provide of the colonial peoples against their imperial masters has been essential to all of the communist efforts and advance in the name of anti-colonialism. The hatred, or supposed hatred, or fomented hatred of peasants for their landlords has been the excuse for all of the widespread crimes and massacres committed by communists in the name of agrarian reform. The supposed hatred of the poor for the rich, which was utterly non-existent in America until the communists went to work to develop it, has been a necessary ingredient of every murderous insurrection in the name of the proletarian revolution which the communists have contrived to inflict on society since the days of the French Revolution. And hatred, assiduously magnified and publicized far beyond its real extent, has been the one always recurrent factor in almost every revolutionary formula which the communists have devised. In the United States, this factor has been most important and most effective in two areas of communist strategy. One is the gigantic fraud known as civil rights. Until the communists got into the picture, the goodwill that had gradually developed and had come to be taken for granted between the Negroes and the white people in our country was a marvelous tribute to both and to the benefits of the American political and economic system. Even Ebony, the leading Negro magazine in America, once said that the United States had made more progress in solving a difficult racial problem than any other nation in history. And because of the advantages and opportunities offered to even the poorest of our citizens, where individual freedom and opportunity prevailed in an expanding economy, a miracle had occurred. Starting only 100 years ago as 4.5 million penniless former slaves, the American Negroes, largely by emulating their white neighbors and with the increasing goodwill and even active help of the white people as a general rule, had arrived at the amazing position of already having the highest standard of living in the world, except only for the white Americans. This was and is true, whether the comparison be of material standards, such as the ownership of automobiles, homes, clothes, bathtubs, and television sets, or of spiritual standards, such as the percentage of the people acquiring college educations or the number of churches which they owned and attended. It comes as quite a surprise to most people today, only because the communists have managed to keep these facts largely suppressed, that the approximately 20 million American Negroes own more than twice as many automobiles as all of the 300 million inhabitants of Soviet Russia and its European satellites put together, or that approximately twice as large a percentage of American Negroes acquire college educations as of the population of England or Germany or France. And there was no limit to the progress ahead until the communists set out by legislation, agitation, and instigation of civil turmoil to foment and build up hatred between the races as the very basis for their revolutionary progress. The second major development and use of hatred as a tool of the revolution had begun far earlier, as a worldwide program, and perhaps in the long run is even more important. This has been the building up and exploitation of the always potential bitterness and distrust between Christians and Jews. For more than 100 years, the communists have done everything possible to revive and increase this source of hatred, which was actually dying out during the increasingly humane tendencies of the 19th century, and especially in the great spirit of open goodwill of all races towards each other, which permeated the opportunities and open spaces and growing prosperity of the United States. There have been many ramifications to the program through which the insiders of the conspiracy have created such a powerful two-edged sword out of what is now known as anti-Semitism. The communists themselves, and especially those of Jewish extraction, have put great effort into nourishing and multiplying hatred of the Jews by Christians, Mohammedans, and all other peoples. One of the most vicious diatribes ever written against the Jews was by Karl Marx, and an English translation has been available for years under the title A World Without Jews. To a communist, there is no loyalty to anything except the communist cause, and betrayal of one's own race is highly praiseworthy if it helps that cause. A more important part of the same campaign, however, has been the attempt to equate the whole conspiracy in the public mind with a Jewish conspiracy. For this purpose, great use has been made of the fact that from about 1848 to about 1937, so many of the activists on the subversive and revolutionary firing lines were of Jewish origin. All of the emotional exploitation of this bit of history has completely ignored these further and parallel facts. One, these activists were the riot brigades, for whom the real conspirators at the top, whose purposes were being served by such criminal dupes, had only loathing and contempt. Two, at the very same time that these direct action fanatics were learning to use dynamite, there were very few Jews in the Fabian Society and in other top-level instrumentalities of the conspiracy which were accomplishing a great deal more for it. Three, Lenin himself did what he could to have himself and his fellow communists of the Jewish race hated more as Jews than as communists. Apparently, he even played a leading part in having much of the actual communist program laid out plainly in writing for the guidance of his followers in a spurious document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, so that the Jews as a whole would be blamed for the program itself. Four, after Lenin and his rabble of stormtroopers, most of whom were Jewish, had served their purpose by seizing power in Russia for the communists, not for the Jews, the inner circle of the conspiracy began gradually to reveal its own anti-Semitic slant, despite the fact that there undoubtedly were and are some Jews within that inner circle, by ridding themselves of Jewish associates and high-level subordinates with all deliberate speed. So that by 1937 or 1938, Stalin had purged practically all Jews out of the top echelons of the conspiracy, even in Russia itself. Today, to the best of our knowledge, there is not a single Jew in the Soviet Presidium or in any other position of high power in the Soviet government, and the degrading treatment of the Jews who live in Russia has now become a disgrace to all mankind. Five, the money of Jewish international bankers has certainly contributed mightily to the revolutionary movement for at least 150 years. When members or representatives of Kuhn-Loeb Company financed the Kerensky Revolution in Russia, it was almost certainly with the expectation that the Bolsheviks would presently take it over. But Lenin himself appears to have been financed for the October Revolution largely from inside Imperial Germany. And certainly, Jewish money was only a part of the vast sums that were already being used by the insiders to carry out their plans. While today the total money that is being provided or can be provided by Jewish bankers for that purpose is a very small fraction indeed of the total money made available for the same purpose by the Rockefellers, Fords, the Morgan interests, and literally scores of other big money insiders whom it is not our business to try to name. There is one key to this whole situation which the misguided bigots who want to blame everything on the Jews should try to grasp. It is that the Jews, because of their experience with persecution in the past, have acquired over the centuries a feeling of closely knit clannishness in the face of possible further persecution, which has made them very susceptible to the wiles of the demagogues who want to capitalize on that fear. And as a result, no people in history have ever been so betrayed, or so easily betrayed, by power-seeking scoundrels within their own ranks as have the Jews. In our opinion, for instance, and we might add in the opinion of many of the best informed and most courageous Jews themselves, the so-called Anti-Defamation League, which ostensibly was founded to prevent or diminish anti-Semitism, has actually done more over the past few decades to promote anti-Semitism than all of the Gerald L.K. Smiths and Richard Cottons put together. For the ADL's power and prosperity as an organization has depended on an increase rather than a decrease of anti-Jewish feelings. And in subtly provoking this increase, they have, of course, mightily helped the communists, which has certainly been the purpose of some of those involved. But there are 2 points which concern us most in this whole discussion. One is that the communists, by all of these plans and machinations, have thus been successful in bringing so many otherwise good anti-communists to see the whole conspiracy as a Jewish plot. These people, falling exactly into the trap designed for them by the communists, fail to realize that the conspiracy is using Jewish communists exactly as it is using Arab communists and Negro communists and Methodist communists and youth communists and union labor communists and similar agents whom it can insinuate into positions of influence and leadership among every group, organization, or division of mankind to forward communist purposes. The historical, geographical, and statistical absurdity of this concept that the whole conspiracy is simply a Jewish plot or is run by Jews can be demonstrated by overwhelming evidence. But once the communists planned falsehoods and distortions superimposed on basic emotions and prejudices have convinced these victims that the Jews are behind it all, the poor gullible dupes become absolutely useless or worse in the struggle to expose and oppose the real conspiracy. For most of them spend all of their time and energy for the rest of their lives, not in fighting the communists, nor even, thank goodness, in any effective assault on Jews in general whom they have learned to hate, but simply in trying to convince everybody else that they are right in their sophomoric interpretation of the problem and in reviling those who disagree with them. Here is a neutralizer which wipes out entirely the opposition of many thousands of alarmed and energetic patriots who should be in the very forefront of those who are trying to create an understanding of the conspiracy. What's more, these people actually wind up materially helping the communists, as we shall see. For the second point in this situation, of great concern to ourselves, is the way the whole theme of anti-Semitism has been developed by the communists into so powerful and effective a two-edged sword. For many years, the communists, using the ADL as a front, tried by extremely intensive and expensive propaganda to have the American people simply take for granted that the John Birch Society was a racist and anti-Semitic organization. And there is no doubt that the attitude thus created was seriously damaging to our recruitment efforts. Today, this pretense has proved to be so visibly absurd, in view of the actual facts becoming increasingly known, that the charge of anti-Semitism does us little harm anymore. But the communists and their ADL friends still keep at it. The other edge of the sword, however, has now become, against us, the more dangerous weapon. Not only the vociferous dupes described above, who spend their days in shouting that it is all a Jewish plot, but tens of thousands of otherwise good Americans who, whether because of communist propaganda or for other reasons, bear at least a veiled animosity towards all Jews, stay clear of the John Birch Society because they have heard us accused of refusing to name the enemy, or at least of being Jew lovers, or guilty of some crime in the same category. And the far more significant point is that both edges of this weapon have been used similarly with tremendous effectiveness against a great many other anti-communist groups and organizations. In the John Birch Society, it is our purpose to expose and oppose the communist conspiracy with the truth, let the chips fall where they may. In carrying out that purpose, we have not hesitated to criticize the American Jewish Committee or any other Jewish organization for what seemed to us to be pro-communist statements or activities, exactly as we have criticized the Protestant National Council of Churches or the National Catholic Welfare Conference for the same reasons. So far as we know, we are the only sizable organization in America that ever went out openly and aggressively to tell the public the truth about that decidedly un-American and pro-communist outfit called the Anti-Defamation League. And yet, right now, the good conservatives of our country are being bombarded by a constant barrage of dirty little sheets of all sizes and from many sources, viciously attacking the John Birch Society, usually with deliberate falsehoods and distortions, because we do not regard all Jews as our enemies, and especially because we are very glad and very proud to have outstandingly patriotic and honorable Jews among our ablest and most dedicated writers, speakers, coordinators, chapter leaders, and members in general. The blind and frequently opportunistic bigots carrying on this raucous smear of the society do not even want to keep their facts straight, even about the communist conspiracy. They only seek instead to give vent to the hatred that has poisoned their souls and to capitalize on that emotion, among others, if they can. We belabor this whole theme because it is so important. Our interest is not in defending the Jews in general against all kinds of charges of undesirable characteristics. In America it is, or at least should be, permissible for any of you to have your choice of personal prejudices, if you feel that way, against the Jews, or against Swedes, or against white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or against any other group, so long as this prejudice stops short of any attempt at persecution or unfair treatment. But to carry that prejudice, in the case of the Jews, or any other group, to the point of blaming on them the conspiracy that is seeking to destroy our civilization, and which is certainly seeking to destroy the Jews, is to fall exactly into the trap which has been so skillfully, patiently, and laboriously prepared for you by the communists to neutralize the anti-communists and otherwise to serve communist purposes. Our job, let us repeat, and what the communists most fear, is to have the whole conspiracy accurately exposed and fully understood. Whatever the communists can do to confuse that issue is of tremendous value to them, and we are dealing here with the most important single source of such stultifying confusion. Finally, the communists extol the extreme desirability of hatred as an abstract mood on the part of all communists towards all other human beings who are not communists or active workers in the conspiracy. Karl Marx preached hatred and practiced it towards almost all of his fellow men throughout his whole existence. Lenin, Lunacharsky, and many other communist leaders constantly preached that communists had to learn to hate if they were going to conquer the world. One of Lenin's minor disciples, but for a few years a leading figure in the Roosevelt entourage, and now one of the satellites of Robert Maynard Hutchins in the subversive outfits he heads up in Santa Barbara, namely Rexford Guy Tugwell, once advised his New Deal followers that they had to acquire, quote, an energizing hatred towards the established order. All of this is sound from the communist point of view, for hatred breeds destruction, and destruction is their goal. Section 9. For many years, the always obvious and sometimes admitted objective of the giant left-wing foundations in our country has been simply this: so to change the economic and political structure of the United States that it can be comfortably merged with Soviet Russia in a one-world communist empire. And in recent years, practically all the forces of the conspiracy have been working to that same end. The purpose here, in the economic field, was not sheer destruction in any absolute sense, but such a complete metamorphosis of the old into something new and different that the old will have been, in reality, completely destroyed. The conspirators have labored hard and with constant success, gradually to remold the Americanist system entirely and absorb the revamped machinery into a worldwide socialist apparatus of production and distribution. Then our giant economic bureaucracy will become the framework through which routine control is exercised over every detail of the lives and actions of the American people. You can now see that metamorphosis being insidiously carried out right before your eyes. And most of what is taking place can be more easily understood if the fundamental difference between a free enterprise economic system and a police state socialist system is recognized at once. The free enterprise system is based on a philosophy of abundance, which requires overproduction as the general rule, with millions of salesmen always trying to move the too much. The socialist system is based on a philosophy of scarcity, with millions of ration clerks always trying to divide the too little. One important result of constantly producing too much is that the sales forces are always reaching out to introduce their products to wider markets, thus making today's luxuries of the comparatively few become tomorrow's commonplace necessities of the many. While as a general rule, the communist bosses do not even want their enslaved subjects to have an abundance of food or of any of the other normal needs of life. They actually prefer a shortage bordering always on famine, for such conditions make it a great deal easier for their bureaucracy to control the people and for themselves to control the bureaucracy. Contrary to a widely held impression, starvation does not lead to revolt. Starvation leads to surrender, as was amply proved in Poland in 1945 to 1947 and in China from 1947 to 1950. And exactly as has been the case in many other countries, approaching starvation in America will also lead to surrender, not to resistance. When the fathers of families find that the only way they can obtain ration cards to get food for their starving children is by knuckling under to the communist machine which controls those ration cards, they knuckle under. Let's look, therefore, at some manifestations of the fundamental communist purpose of transforming our economy. The direct steps to this end were begun under Roosevelt, with the killing of pigs and the plowing under of crops. The next huge steps in the preparation and rehearsal for the normal conditions of the future came with the rationing of sugar, gasoline, and other commodities during World War II. These measures set the initial course for three great parallel drives. First is the gradual conversion of abundance into scarcity. The very momentum of the American free enterprise system has made this quite difficult. But the communists and their liberal dupes have been and still are working on the problem day and night, and now with more imminent prospects of success. In a new world war, for instance, no matter how phonily it might be conducted, the strict rationing of meat and bread and gasoline and clothing, and the government allocation of housing and industrial raw materials and labor and machinery and production could be made to appear both reasonable and obligatory. The second drive, somewhat dependent on the first, has been to make more and more of the American people, and especially including our farmers, subservient to bureaucratic decisions and favors for their temporary welfare and prosperity. But the third and most important of all has been the undertaking to destroy the entrepreneurial spirit in America altogether. It is the aim of the insiders to have all business firms of any size run more and more by hired managers instead of by owners, and to force the absorption of small businesses into larger ones, and of those combinations into still larger ones, so that more and more of commerce and industry becomes a publicly owned operation run by a huge hired bureaucracy. Such large companies are then far easier to incorporate into a whole system of production which is theoretically owned by the people and is formally run by agents of the state, because they are already only one step removed from that final arrangement. To bring about this last development, the insiders have been relying primarily for many years on the taxing power of government, as applied in the following three ways. A. First, the combination of corporate and personal income taxes has been designed to make it now almost impossible for any entrepreneurial person or group to accumulate out of profits the capital needed for expansion. Any such business which wishes to grow in size, therefore, must either turn to the public for the capital to do so, and thus diffuse its ownership and control, or it must seek to be absorbed as a unit into some larger company which can supply the capital, usually because the larger company is already publicly owned or can more readily attract the needed capital from the public. B. And the second effect of the same force at work has been through inheritance taxes. A man may have built up a highly successful and profitable business which he largely owns. It may be one which, as long as he is alive, can still make money and grow slowly despite the current tax burdens. But if so, there is hardly a chance in the world that it can be in the utterly uneconomic position of having enough liquid funds to supply the cash which will have to be paid out by his estate as inheritance taxes at the time of the owner's death. So more and more every year, family-owned businesses have felt the imperative need of selling out to some larger company while their own chief stockholders were still alive. C, giving a tremendous assist to those uses of taxation is the further government weapon of inflation. For inflation, fundamentally, is nothing more nor less than a form of vicious and cruel stealing by a government from its own people through actions and policies which dilute the value of their money. In the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, this writer, while emphasizing that some limited amount of government was absolutely necessary for any civilized social organization, still pointed out that in actual practice, throughout all observed and recorded history, the greatest enemy of man was and always had been government. And of all the means used by governments to cheat, despoil, exploit, and oppress their subjects, the most foul and cruel has been a deliberately conducted inflation of their currency. There is an utter lack of any need or justification whatsoever for inflation in a country as productive as the United States, where, if the currency had been left passive, unmanaged, and completely redeemable in gold, it would constantly have bought more and more instead of less and less. Also, among the most vicious falsehoods ever sold to the gullible American people is the claim that increased taxation serves to prevent inflation. It is supposed to do so by draining off purchasing power, and hence the demand for goods and services which causes prices to rise. Actually, increasing taxation not only does not slow down inflation, but is, for many reasons, one of the surest ways of speeding it up. A major reason is that money left in the hands of individual owners, even in so profligate an era as this has become, will still be spent with a certain amount of prudence and frugality, while the same money transferred into the hands of government will inevitably be spent with unbelievable speed and wastefulness. The manifold uses, however, to which the criminal weapon of inflation and the ever-increasing squeeze of taxation have been put by the last 6 administrations, including the present one, is too large a subject for any adequate discussion here. The point to be noted, and which certainly should frighten you, is that every one of these uses has added cumulative force to the pressures that are pushing and molding our American economic environment into the form of state socialism, which is the communist goal for their world economic order. With regard to the communist efforts to change our political system, we should have to be much more concise. Let us merely point out, therefore, that the objective is just the same as in the economic field. There have been and are many continuing steps leading toward the ultimate absorption of what is now the United States as merely one or more geographical and administrative provinces into a worldwide communist empire. The activities being carried on to that end include the following campaigns. A, to change our republic into a democracy as a necessary intermediate step on the way to a mobocracy and then dictatorship. B, to corrupt our judiciary system to the point where rule by established law is replaced with rule by the arbitrary decisions of biased men. C, to convert our legislative bodies into fuzzy rubber stamps for giving a semblance of legality to the usurpations of power by the executive branches of government. D, to eliminate all differences between our two major political parties, and thus to convert our national elections into a gigantic stage-managed show. E, to establish an entrenched communist-controlled bureaucracy which assures the continuity of pro-communist policies right through all election periods and afterwards, regardless of the election results. F, to bring about the piecemeal but increasingly drastic surrender of sovereignty over our own national affairs to international organizations. G, to establish and enforce the completely unconstitutional principle that treaty law supersedes domestic law and even our Constitution itself. H, to have our government interlock our affairs with those of other nations and assume an imperialistic responsibility for the supposed welfare of other nations all over the world. I, to allow and even encourage armed insurrections and open sedition to run wild from one end of our country to the other. And J, to create so vast a bureaucracy that the framework for a police state socialist system is already at hand. Parallel to these drives of a more tangible nature, there has been a continuous and pervasive psychological campaign to eliminate the whole concept of nationalism. Loyalty to country is constantly disparaged, especially by politicians in high places. This movement and the activities identified above to destroy the United States as the independent nation which we inherited are all simply parts of the total communist program being carried out right before our eyes. Section 10. The communists know that they cannot possibly permit any other loyalty except to the communist state. So they have proceeded for a long time on the principle that they simply had to destroy the three basic human loyalties: loyalty to country, loyalty to family, and loyalty to God. We have just touched on their attempt to discredit all loyalty to country and to make every person think of himself as a citizen of the world. Not nearly so well recognized, but of even greater importance to the communists, is the weakening of all loyalty to the family and eventual destruction of the family altogether as anything more than a temporary arrangement for economic convenience. As a huge first step in this direction, and as a major objective in itself, all children in America are to be brought, as they already have been in Soviet Russia, to look to the government and be grateful to the government instead of to their parents for the food they eat, the clothes they wear, the room they sleep in, the education they receive, and whatever recreation or pleasures may be provided for them. In the ultimate stage of this sinister development, the child will be taken completely and officially out from under any parental influence and subjected formally and continuously to the brutalizing physical training and mental brainwashing of the communist state. This plan is succeeding so well and has already been carried so far that it is time to change the name of our public schools to government schools. It may shock you to realize it, but that is what they really are today. Your so-called public schools are no longer agencies of the parents, established and run by groups of parents as a means of carrying out their parental responsibility for the education of their children. These schools have already become agencies of government, and thus a means of indoctrinating the growing generation with the falsehoods, beliefs, and outlook which government wants them to have. And this is a government, let us assure you, which for all practical purposes is, and for the last preceding 5 administrations has been, controlled by the communists. Of course, they always advance this control into new fields, mainly by pressures and propaganda, rather than by force, as they are now doing with regard to sex education in the schools, which, among other purposes, removes from parents almost the last vestige of responsibility for the upbringing and the character of their children. At present, the communists have a real battle on their hands over this issue, and while they will use all the force of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and of other government agencies to help them put over their program, they do not yet dare have the federal government simply order all public schools to adopt this program. That, if they are successful, will come later, as it has already come in connection with such matters as patriotism, where a subordinate of Attorney General Ramsey Clark boasted that of course they would transfer a high school history teacher to some other job if he insisted on teaching American history contrary to the government's wishes. Remember, however, that the communists seek to destroy our whole civilization, and the family has been a fundamental structural unit and a tremendously stabilizing influence in this civilization. So their plans and interests go much further than simply seizing control of and gradually warping the minds of our children. They want it to become standard practice for this sociological brick called the family to be made without straw or without any ingredient or reinforcement to give it strength. Then all such bricks will universally and automatically crumble under the pressures which are placed upon society as a whole. There are many drives for these purposes. A. One such campaign is to have our young people raised in complete ignorance of the cost, in the sweat and blood and tears of their ancestors, of either the spiritual or material aspects of the life which they have inherited. Today's children in the United States are growing up to take for granted that providence or fate or some mysterious force with which they are not concerned simply placed on this earth the houses and factories and highways and churches and theaters and recreation fields and the automobiles and wristwatches and television sets and farms and packing plants and dairies, and all the marvelous system of distribution and of service which makes it possible for them to live like kings. They take for granted that the freedoms which they enjoy, of movement, of interests, of occupation, if any, of hobbies, of pleasures, and of choice about almost every aspect of their lives, are something natural, also supplied them by providence or fate, and without any concern for the lives that were sacrificed and the hardships that were suffered to provide this best environment for the human race that the world has ever seen, our young people actually think they are being noble in their rebelliousness against a system of which they have no understanding. It is perfectly obvious as an axiom, and supported empirically by all historical experience, that equal people can never be free, for the simple reason that free people will never remain equal. But these youngsters, as somebody has said, have never read the minutes of the last meeting. They not only do not have the slightest grasp of the fact that they are literally the heirs of all the ages, but they have been sold on the idea of destroying their inheritance without ever even recognizing its value, all of which is the result of deliberate, patient, and cunning effort on the part of a vast, destructive, and criminal conspiracy. B. Our young people are being encouraged from the earliest age and by every means which such communist-dominated influences as the National Education Association can devise, not only to regard the state rather than their parents as responsible for their welfare, but to look on their parents with increasing scorn, to regard themselves as smarter and wiser and more progressive than their parents, to flout all experience as something to which they are automatically superior, and gradually to acquire a feeling of open and active hostility, not only toward their parents, but toward all authority of every kind. In fact, the most famous and infamous contemporary philosopher of this whole exciting theme of youthful bitterness, a professed Marxist named Herbert Marcuse, has acquired his worldwide notoriety largely on the basis of his argument that all youth in general should be in combat with all their elders in general. And by combat, Marcuse has made clear through both his language and his actions that he means armed and destructive insurrection, all of which, of course, exactly serves communist purposes. C. The American home used to be a permanent headquarters of individuals bound closely together with major beliefs, interests, and loyalties held generally in common. It is being reduced to a meeting place of temporary convenience for individuals who expect their ties to each other to become of less and less strength and importance. Or at least this is what the communists are trying to bring about. The most direct measure for accomplishing this, of course, is development of the readier acceptance of divorce and of the greater ease by which divorce may be obtained. And that the communists are doing all they can to speed up this development is too obvious for either statistics or argument to be needed. D. Finally, in this section, let's mention the continuous and many-sided efforts to destroy the religious base, the moral significance, and the spiritual sanctity of marriage. To whatever extent the communists are able to have their own way, especially with this sex education in the schools from kindergarten to high school that they are now trying to put across, practically all young couples will have engaged in sexual intercourse before their wedding, and marriage will become, in this country, as it already is in communist parts of the world, nothing more than a civil contract formalized by a civil service without any religious or moral significance and having no attributes of a different quality from any other contractual agreement. And this whole purpose is being carried forward, of course, by the communist-promoted drive, especially among our young people, to make premarital sex relations commonplace, adultery a delightful custom, and monogamy a subject of ridicule. And again, our whole point is that all of these promotions and trends are carefully plotted parts of the total design of the communists for first destroying civilization in America, as elsewhere, and then fastening their despotic rule over the resulting ruins. Section 11. Even more important to the communists on their list of targets for destruction than loyalty to family is loyalty to God. From the very beginning of their conspiracy, they have realized, unceasingly impressed on all members of the conspiracy, and boldly informed the world that all religion had to be destroyed before their rule over the planet could be established and maintained. At the time of the French Revolution, and for 100 years thereafter, the conspirators engaged in a frontal attack on religion, on both the planes of philosophy and of action. Eventually, however, the communists became smart enough and patient enough to go to work on their greatest enemy, Christianity, by the only method at which they have ever been successful in overcoming any enemy, namely by infiltration and distortion and erosion and destruction from the inside. There is one simple key which explains how the communists have been so successful at infiltrating the clergy. It is that preachers do not become communists, but communists do become preachers. When some young man is converted during his college years into a hardcore communist, without having the wealth of the family background to be taken directly into the circle of insiders, the question arises on or before his graduation as to what he can best do for the cause. By the 1920s, a considerable number of them were being told to go to a theological seminary, come out as ordained ministers, and then proceed to use that position of great influence cautiously but cleverly and effectively for the benefit of the communist advance. So that by about 1950, the communists already had in the Protestant ministry their 3% of the total, which is all they need to control any committee, any group, any organization, or any population. For the communists always know exactly what they're trying to promote, and they are both brilliantly cunning and utterly ruthless in that promotion, while everybody else flounders around in the usual manner of committee and group activities. In the Catholic Church, this process of infiltration was much slower for a number of reasons. One was that a young hardcore communist, on being ordered to go through all the necessary motions and pretenses in order to become a priest, had to forego the possibility of marriage, had to spend anywhere from 7 to 12 years in the Catholic seminaries, and had to make many other more visible sacrifices of normal life for the sake of his hypocritical role. There was a great deal more time and expense involved for the communists, and a much greater risk that any particular agent would lose his enthusiasm and defect from the cause before he ever became a priest. But despite these problems, the procedure was diligently continued, with the result that today more and more so-called priests are beginning to show up on the American scene and become active in communist-instituted turmoil around them, as well as influential in communist-dominated schools and colleges, who are not really priests at all. They are actually communists parading in priests' clothing. Some of the more subtle and clever among them even climb in time into higher levels of the hierarchy. And because of the immense respect and authority accorded by Catholics to their priests, every one of these men, even as a parish pastor, can do a tremendously effective job of helping to tear down the Catholic Church, the American economic and political system, and our whole civilization as well. Through this continuous infiltration of both communist personnel and communist influence into both the Protestant and eventually even the Catholic churches, the communists now feel increasingly able to bring about a transformation of organized Christianity from the inside into a gigantic machine in support of what is called the social gospel and for the promotion of revolutionary principles and purposes in general. In fact, they are now undertaking to merge Christianity and communism into one temporal philosophy. They can thus more easily beguile millions of Christians, or of people who still regard themselves as Christians, into believing the humanitarian pretenses of various communist movements and into supporting many segments of the one biggest lie, which is that communism has any sincere interest whatsoever in the welfare of the people. And they can thus also be moving the pieces into place for the materialization of their ultimate goal, which is to bring not just Christian churches, but all organized religion everywhere and of every kind into one homogeneous monolithic body which will serve simply as a worldwide propaganda agency for maintaining the worldwide rule of the communist regime. Religion itself will have been completely destroyed, but its temporal framework will have been taken over and molded into the service of the atheists who destroyed it. With that much background in mind, therefore, it becomes much easier to understand the origin, the development, and the purposes of such widely varied phenomena as the following. 1. The preaching of Marxism under the brilliantly deceptive name of the social gospel from the pulpits of our churches. 2. The participation by members of the clergy in civil rights marches and insurrectionary disturbances of every kind. 3. The massive lobbying by representatives of the National Council of Churches in support of the troublemaking civil rights legislation of recent years. 4. The bringing together with great good fellowship and ostentatious accord in purpose of American church leaders and so-called church leaders of the communist countries in the World Council of Churches. 5. The immense breakdown of tradition, authority, unity, and purpose within the Catholic Church. 6. The open and growing support by thousands of members of the Protestant clergy of homosexuality and other forms of sexual perversion. 7. The widespread promotion by the National Council of Churches of book lists recommending the most obscene and blasphemous and revolutionary books by known communists, comsimps, and criminals. 8. The increasing welcome given by even Catholic colleges to the most brazenly blasphemous, revolutionary, and spiritually subversive perverts and traitors on the American scene. 9. The desecration of our churches themselves by services and activities which make a mockery of all religion. And 10. The promotion by church bodies and church leaders, both Catholic and Protestant, of so-called training programs and seminars and miscellaneous movements which subtly undermine all the fundamental bases of religious belief and purposes. Again, let us insist, all of these things are but related parts of one overall program, and that is a program to promote the communist advance through destructiveness, chaos, and confusion to an absolute tyranny over the ruins that will be left. Section 12, which brings us to the last and now the most important of all the categories of communist plans and efforts that we can deal with tonight. This one comprises the manifold and varied drives to destroy all morality. The communists are not concerned about whether moral principles are based on revealed religion or on a distillation of man's best customs, manners, traditions, and experience. They do not care in the least, for instance, whether adultery is regarded as a sin because the Bible says so, or because man has learned the value of monogamy as a support of solidity and happiness in a civilized society. All the communists want in this connection is to promote adultery among us, because it will help them to destroy the American character and the Americanist civilization. And the same thing is true for every other form of immorality and crime now being so successfully instigated, condoned, encouraged, and even glorified by the communists and their dupes and allies who permeate our whole social organization. As a consequence of this design, we see all around us today carefully plotted and extensively conducted campaigns to bring about the following results. A. The much greater and rapidly increasing use of narcotic drugs, especially among young people. B. The much more frequent and more immoderate use of alcohol, again especially among the young. C. A degrading, debilitating, and disease-producing promiscuousness with regard to sexual relations, aggravated by a steadily growing acceptance and practice of sexual perversion. D. An incredible ubiquitousness of filth and pornography on our newsstands, on the stage, in our movies, over the air, and now to a considerable extent already in our schools, our churches, and our social gatherings of every variety. E. The rapidly increasing amount of crime of every nature, from petty theft and crooked vote counting to rape and murder. F. The huge amount of deliberate vandalism and arson, not even for the material benefit of those committing such crimes, but purely for the sake of the destructiveness itself. G. The generally condoned and even widely glorified rebellion against all authority, carried to flagrantly criminal excesses. H. The widespread exhibitionism with regard to dirty clothes, dirty bodies, dirty language, and obviously dirty minds, as supposedly representing some form of protest against the existing order. I. The constant encouragement and actual reward by welfare agencies of the production of illegitimate children. J. The propagation and acceptance of outright treason, even in the highest circles of government, and even when it costs the lives of American boys fighting in the uniform of their country, as merely a form of disagreement rather than a crime. K. The ready acceptance of deliberate lies by government, press, pulpit, and college as simply a normal part of present-day communication. L. And the attempted gradual conversion of our whole educational system from kindergarten to college into a vast propaganda machine on behalf of every hypocrisy, foulness, and crime which the communists have been able to promote on our contemporary scene. Our main point once again, and for the last time in such a connection, is that every one of these campaigns to eliminate morality and destroy character is an integral part of the communist program for establishing their tyranny over the people of the United States. That finishes the survey of our 8 categories. It would be helpful to cover many more and to look much more thoroughly at the extensive ramifications of those we have inspected. But all of these further pieces would simply round out the same premise, and this presentation has to be kept to the limits of a synopsis rather than an encyclopedia. So we must move on to our final section, dealing with the problem of preventing the ultimate catastrophe that is bearing down upon us. Section 13. The question immediately arises, of course, as to whether anything can be done about this greatest crime in history. And our confident answer is that it certainly can, precisely because this is a deliberately plotted crime. If the tragedy now enveloping the American nation and the brutal slavery now threatening the American people were the result of natural sociological forces at work, such as occurred during the declining centuries of every successful civilization, reversing the trend would be a superhuman task. But for a nation or an individual, preventing murder is altogether different from prolonging life indefinitely against natural diseases. So let us restate the actual situation. The still young, still strong, and until a generation ago still healthy, organic body of the American civilization is being willfully murdered by a long-range conspiracy of power-seeking criminals to serve their own evil ambitions. In order gradually to accomplish this murder, disguised as natural death, as has been many a murder before it, these megalomaniacs are insidiously attacking and weakening their intended victim with every form of poison for both body and mind, and with every form of direct material mistreatment that their diabolical intention and experience can possibly bring into play, including, but not limited to, all of those methods that we have listed in the earlier sections of this analysis. What's more, this is planned to be not only a secret murder, but by a secret and unidentified criminal. For more essential to the total plot than any of its segments which we have discussed is the unceasing effort of the conspirators to keep the world, and especially the American people, from realizing that there even is a conspiracy. The insiders issue countless statements and go through tireless motions with the phoning support of a subservient press which they now control to maintain the colossal pretense that the communists and the anti-communists are engaged in an ideological struggle. The philosophies of collectivism and of conservatism are supposed to be battling against each other on the academic and political levels for the intellectual acceptance that will bring victory to either side. To emphasize the value of this sham, Moscow even issued instructions on January 1, 1969, in the form of an editorial in International Affairs, which contained the following sentence, quote, "The struggle between capitalism and socialism in the sphere of ideology and politics is becoming ever more acute. The ideological front is now developing into the most important one in this struggle." End of quotation. In fact, so vital is this deception to the strategy of the insiders that they welcome and sometimes even subsidize the most vigorous opposition to their collectivist program, provided that opposition is kept on an academic or political plane with no mention of the conspiracy at work underneath. The whole show is an enormous fraud. Of course, the total communist propaganda wins over a few deluded converts who become revolutionary stooges. And of course, the left-wing politicians, some of whom are insiders and some of whom are merely demagogic opportunists, make full use of this propaganda with all of its lies and impossible promises to advance collectivist and welfare measures which lead toward total government. But the real drive is well below all of this superficial debate. Under cover of the ideological confrontation, the conspirators are using every conceivable form of diplomacy, deception, pressure, coercion, bribery, crime, treason, and terror to destroy the present social order and to seize more and more power at every turn. They then claim that these acquisitions of power are the result of ideological conquests. As good a key as can be found to the whole spirit and nature of the conspiracy lies in the slogan with which its earlier members helped to foment all the horror of the French Revolution. That slogan was Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. It did not actually move many of the mob to action. Even the siege of the Bastille had to be carried out by professional hoodlums, most of them imported into Paris from other countries, while Jean-Paul Marat expressed his disgust at the lack of any revolutionary fervor on the part of the Parisian people. But it did lead millions to believe, then and now, that these revolutionary actions were being taken by idealists in spontaneous support of the slogan's objective. For the conspirators have counted heavily from the day of Weishaupt on the human race being composed mostly of gullible fools. The same cruel and ruthlessly deceptive pretense as to goals and objectives has been used by the evolving and tightening conspiratorial oligarchy ever since. Like more modern and more specific versions of this completely synthetic and phony idealism, such as agrarian reform, civil rights, and the war on poverty, this ringing phrase, liberté, égalité, fraternité, even in its various paraphrases and translations, has brilliantly dramatic qualities for leading fools into the net which tyrants have prepared to entrap them. It is important to realize, therefore, that what the insiders who control this conspiracy really seek and have always sought to achieve in the name of liberty or liberation is complete enslavement of the masses. In the name of equality is the greatest difference in living conditions between the oligarchy at the top and the slaves at the bottom that history has ever seen. And in the name of fraternity or brotherhood, the most extensive and pervasive distrust, dissension, and resentment between all possible groupings of the population that can be contrived as a means of making all of these divided people easier to rule. All aspects of this conspiracy constitute a gigantic lie, as the people of Russia and China and Czechoslovakia and East Germany and Algeria and Cuba and a score of other countries can so pitifully testify. And as the people of our country will also learn unless the lie can be exposed in time. Not by persuasion do the communists achieve their goals, but by deception and crime and cruelty more massive and more ruthless than mankind has ever faced before. And this horror, my friends, is what we face today, bearing down upon us and closing in from every side. But the American giant still has many times the strength needed to arouse itself, shake loose from this whole smothering process, and to recuperate rapidly from the damage already done. It needs only to be made aware that it is being murdered and that it is not suffering from the inevitably fatal ravages of natural disease. We repeat in plain language for probably the 100th time, all it will take to stop this murder, and the only thing that will stop it, is sufficient understanding on the part of the American people as to what is really taking place. Section 14, which brings us, at long last, to the role of the John Birch Society in these final stages of a great historic struggle. For we believe not only that these evil forces can still be exposed and stopped and routed, but that the Society and its allies will have to be the decisive factor in bringing this about. We do not see any other group on the horizon today with even the slightest possibility of changing the course of history as it has been projected and supposedly predetermined by the conspiracy. But we do not deceive ourselves or anybody else about our own chances either. We are entirely realistic about both the nature and the size of the task, so that in seeking the added strength which would clearly enable us to win, we think it is our best course to review briefly but frankly what we are, what we have accomplished so far, and what we hope to accomplish in the future. A. The John Birch Society is a completely open and voluntary association. There are no initiation fees, no initiation rights, no special passwords for identification or codes for communication within the society, and no secrets of any kind. The only formal requirement for membership is that you sign an application blank and have it approved by some authorized representative of the society. Also, any member may resign at any time without any formality at all, and with only good wishes and goodwill from the officers, the staff, and the other members of the society. The John Birch Society was founded in Indianapolis on December 9, 1958. During the 10 years since then, we have sought to bring into the society only men and women of good character, humane consciences, and religious ideals. For we are striving to set an example by dedication, integrity, and purpose in word and deed, which our children's children may follow without hesitation. Members of the society are of all races, colors, and creeds. We are of all social, economic, and educational levels. We are individualists who disagree among ourselves about many things, but we are firmly united in devotion to those beliefs, principles, and purposes which we do hold in common. For we have voluntarily joined together, 1, to combat more effectively the evil forces which now threaten our freedom, our lives, our country, and our civilization. 2, to prevail upon our fellow citizens to start pulling out of the deepening morass of collectivism and then climb up the mountain to higher levels of individual freedom and responsibility than man has ever achieved before. 3, to restore with brighter luster and deeper conviction the faith-inspired morality the spiritual sense of values, and the ennobling aspirations on which our Western civilization has been built. The long-range objective of the society has been summarized as less government, more responsibility, and a better world. These permanent purposes brought us immediately into conflict with the communists on two levels. On the ideological plane, the communists seek always and everywhere to bring about more government, less individual responsibility, and the abrogation of all morality. And on the plane of action, until the communists can be stopped from completing their subjugation of the whole world, there will be no opportunity for us to move forward at all towards our permanent goals. We have undertaken, therefore, to play a leading role in slowing down, stopping, and eventually routing the communist conspiracy. We realize that the one thing no conspiracy can withstand is the light of day on its activities. The only danger to their gigantic conspiracy which the communists fear is exposure. For this reason, we do all that we can to bring to our fellow citizens more knowledge and a better understanding of the methods, the progress, and the menace of the communist machine. In this undertaking, we have become a new form of opposition to the communists, which they have never faced before in any of the vast areas they have already taken over. So let's look now again very briefly at some of the inadequate but encouraging measures of our success. B. Among these accomplishments of the past 10 years, we might clearly list the following. 1. We have created a new form of opposition to the communists which they have never faced before in any of the vast areas they have already taken over. This is an organized and sizable army of patriotic citizens with a paid and professional field staff determined to stop the communists by adherence to one single-minded course of action, which has been expressed in this sentence: education is our total strategy, and truth is our only weapon. It is our undertaking to sharpen the weapon of truth and sweep it across the land. 2. When the John Birch Society was formed in 1958, there was very little literature readily available for our purpose. The comparatively few honest and authoritative books which had been written on the subject had in general either been refused publication or completely smothered by the left after one small printing. We have rescued some 24 of the best of those books from oblivion through inexpensive reprints, of which millions of copies have been sold. We have ourselves been the original publishers of some 24 new books exposing various aspects and activities of the conspiracy, which have had a correspondingly wide distribution. And we have brought out a veritable flood of pamphlets, now running to more than 200 titles, dealing with almost every phase and stage of the communist program. 3. We have established a monthly magazine, American Opinion, as the most authoritative in the world on what the communists are really doing on all fronts to advance their tyranny. More recently, we've established a weekly magazine, The Review of the News, which is already becoming increasingly important as the one dependable and badly needed source of objective news reporting while the news is still current. 4. Because the commercial book channels of America were almost completely closed to anti-communist books, we have been obliged to create our own means and outlets of distribution. These now include over 450 reading rooms that sell books scattered across the country, which sell not only our materials, but those of 100 other publishers. Very important new books on the communist menace are now being brought out by quite a number of these publishers in what adds up to a steady stream. Today there is a vast and growing literature of reliable information on every facet of the conspiracy, and we can certainly claim credit for a major role in bringing about this encouraging development. We have established a Speakers Bureau, which, measured by the number of engagements filled, is probably the largest in the world. There are about 100 speakers on our active roster. But what is more important for total effectiveness, about a score of these speakers, ably qualified to describe the danger and horror of communism from sound knowledge of first-hand experience, are constantly making regular tours with 25 to 75 engagements before paying public audiences on that many consecutive nights. And in their free daily appearances on these same tours, before high school assemblies, service clubs, other organized groups, and over local radio and television stations, they multiply the total audience which they reach manyfold, with a cumulative educational impact that is tremendous and far-reaching. 6. We have set up thousands of ad hoc committees, consisting about 90% of patriotic citizens who are not even Birchers, each of which committees is engaged in multiple efforts to inform and alarm the public in its region or community about some particular part of the communist program, Chief among these groups, scattered all over the United States, are our Support Your Local Police Committees, our TAC committees, which spread the truth about civil turmoil, our TRAIN committees, which hammer away at the need to restore American independence now, and the Motor Read committees of our movement to restore decency, which have been springing up with immense enthusiasm during 1969. 7. Our specific educational accomplishments of most importance so far through all of these labors, programs, and facilities include the following. A. We have awakened millions of Americans to the size, nature, and purpose of the communist efforts to undermine the morale, the authority, and the effectiveness of our local police forces. B. We have brought hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens to realize what the Supreme Court was doing to destroy our Constitution, to rewrite our laws, and to make the path far easier for communists and other criminals. C. We have not been content simply to oppose the advance of the ideology of collectivism, but have hammered away ever since we started at the existence and the menace of the conspiracy. Today, various polls indicate that 80% of the American people believe the communists are influencing our elections to an alarming extent, and that over 50% believe the communists to be behind the riots on our college campuses. These are degrees of ad hoc awareness which would have been fantastic 10 years ago, and for this partial awakening in some areas, we can certainly claim some of the credit. D. We have, we believe, done more to show the communist plans and hands behind the so-called civil rights movement than all other groups in America put together. Through books, pamphlets, films, film strips, and speakers, we have worked incessantly on this problem since the Society was founded. The activities of our members have been directly responsible for saving several cities from rioting that was already planned, and for creating a far greater general understanding of this important segment of the communist strategy than would otherwise have been possible. E. We have exposed the communist connections and purposes of the so-called war on poverty to such an extent that in some few areas the opposition led by our members has even compelled the OEO to withdraw its agencies from those areas altogether. These were only straws in the wind, but the wind is rising. F. While other groups opposed to American foreign aid have been going out of business, our fight against the vast treasonous help by our government to our communist enemies is just now getting a solid footing and gaining in momentum. Our fifth progress report on our petition drive against economic and military aid to communist regimes shows nearly 1.5 million signatures on petitions which have already been delivered to members of Congress, and we expect this drive to become steadily more impressive until such aid is finally discontinued. G. In January 1969, we entered into the fight against sex education in the schools. Since then, our nationwide organization and staff have made tremendous contributions to public understanding of what this pornographic fraud is all about and how it is intended to serve communist purposes. We believe that our help will be decisive in getting such corruptive materials, teaching, and practices out of our schools, and even more important, that our whole movement to restore decency is going to become a powerful and constructive force on the American scene. It is our belief that education is the effective means and political action only the mechanics for bringing about changes in government. It is worthwhile for us to glance at least briefly, therefore, at some political results that have clearly followed on the heels of our educational efforts. But we'll confine this look to just 3 illustrations. First was the overwhelming defeat in 1966 of Mayor Lindsay's referendum for a civilian police review board in New York City. For Lindsay and the left-wing machine had gone all out on this issue with full confidence in their success. Yet not only did they fail, but this resounding failure marked the end, for all practical purposes, of the whole nationwide drive for civilian police review boards. And the part played by the John Birch Society in bringing this about through the educational work of its Support Your Local Police Committees and of our members themselves was well known at the time. The second victory was in stopping Abe Fortas in 1968 from being made Chief Justice of the United States and in eventually driving him off the Supreme Court altogether. There were many people who had a hand in that effort in many ways, both behind the scenes and in the direct opposition to Fortas. The letter-writing campaign put on by our members and by many other groups and individuals certainly played an important part. But Walter Reuther's Cope and most of the liberal press blamed this, quote, catastrophe, unquote, on the long educational job of the John Birch Society through its Impeach Warren campaign in creating widespread public distrust of the Supreme Court and its activities. this distrust was amply justified, and a far wider and deeper understanding of what the Supreme Court has been doing to destroy our republic is badly needed. We do take some pride, however, in the progress we have made. But the outstanding example, the most encouraging thing that has happened during the life of the John Birch Society, and in our opinion, the most significant defeat the communists have suffered in the United States in over 40 years, was the sharp victory of Yorty over Bradley in the 1969 election for mayor of Los Angeles. For this election was of immense importance to the communists and the whole super-liberal pack. They were willing to use every dirty tactic and ruthless maneuver in the book on behalf of their man, Tom Bradley, a Negro member of the city council. And they were determined to have him win at all costs. By they, we mean the communists and their allies throughout the United States, and not just in California. And we do mean at all costs, too. The highly respected local broadcaster, George Putnam, just about the only conservative with any sizable following now left on the air in Los Angeles, stated that Bradley's campaign had cost $7 million, which was poured into Los Angeles from all over the country. They not only sent in oceans of money from the outside, they also sent in left-wing politicians and businessmen of national reputation to overwhelm the opposition in this campaign for the mayor's job in just one American city. These active big-name backers of Bradley included Senator Percy of Illinois, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, Senator Jacob Javits of New York, former Senator Thomas Kickle of California, Leonard Firestone, and others. And the Los Angeles Times led the pack in the mass communications field in going all out for Bradley's election. For this was to be not only a sharp and decisive reversal of the trend back towards political conservatism which has been taking place in California, but an almost fatal blow to the morale of the anti-communists everywhere. If Bradley had won, you would have seen headlines in every city in the United States screaming about its significance. For not only would the newly elected mayor of one of America's largest cities have been a militant Negro racist, but a man whose communist affiliations and sympathies were well known. And of course, they expected to win. The polls were announcing Bradley's victory as certain, well in advance. Even most of the conservatives in Southern California itself were frankly and sadly confessing their private opinions that Bradley would win right up to the election. It was obviously because of this confidence that the Los Angeles Times went all out in support of Bradley, and thus disclosed where it really stood more clearly than it had ever done before. But the polls in the press turned out to be wrong, which proves that the conservatives should have more confidence. Among other extremely serious matters at stake was the control of the police force of the city. Just as it was in the defeat of John Lindsay for the Republican nomination for mayor in New York City that occurred shortly thereafter. Both campaigns demonstrated the tremendous value and effectiveness of our drive over many years for public support of our local police forces. But it was the outcome of this election for mayor of Los Angeles which showed far more clearly than anything else since the John Birch Society was formed the beneficial results of what our members and our ad hoc committees have been doing in their tireless educational labors. For it was the slowly growing understanding of the communist conspiracy, of how the communists work, of the nature of their propaganda, and of their real purposes which made possible the defeat of Thomas Bradley. In the actual campaign itself, the policemen of Los Angeles and the firemen did a tremendous amount of hard work in every precinct. So did individual Birchers, acting, like any other good citizens, entirely on their own. This was of great importance and undoubtedly was the decisive factor in the election. But without the understanding of the picture that had been created by the steady educational work of the Birch members, the Birch chapters, the Birch staff, and the Birch committees over the last few years, there would not have been any such determined drive of resistance to the communist steamroller, and the public would not have been nearly as receptive to what these precinct workers had to say. So let us repeat here, with all the emphasis we can convey, the guiding principle in our total program. Education is the means of bringing about changes in government or in political thinking, and political action itself is only the mechanics for reaping the benefit of that education. We could continue this review for several pages and list a great many other but lesser victories, both in our educational campaigns and in political results. But this is not the time or place to do so. For the sad truth, my friends, is that we have not been able to do nearly enough. Above all else, we are realists in this struggle and about the size of the job we have undertaken. And up to this point, ours has not been very much more than a successful pilot operation, showing what can be done. But through all the smears and obstacles, we have kept our eyes steadily on the levels of size and resources and organization and activities, which we feel would enable us to create the sufficiently widespread understanding needed for victory, So let us outline these plans as concisely as we can. C. What we are asking of you good people who will be hearing this presentation is to come on in and help us to reach the following goals. 1. We need a fully paid member of our field staff in every congressional district, plus an appropriate number of supervisors. This would mean approximately 500 men in the field altogether. Even though the John Birch Society itself never supports or endorses any political candidate and never takes any part or position in political campaigns, we are using congressional districts as measuring units in this and the following paragraphs for two reasons. First, they are reasonably uniform in population, which states, cities, counties, or other geographical divisions are not. And second, because this suggests at once the ultimate underlying support which our educational campaigns might provide for conservative candidates of any or all parties in the political field. 2. We need an average of 1,000 members in every congressional district. This would mean a total of a little over 400,000 members altogether. With the now increasing awareness of good Americans everywhere that something is surely wrong, this total of just the kind of highly respected and responsible members that we want could rapidly be acquired if we could afford the field staff first. 3. We need an average of 50 ad hoc committees, tack, train, support your local police, motor read, and others in every congressional district. This would mean a little over 20,000 ad hoc committees in the United States as a whole. And all it would take to reach this goal is simply sufficient staff to put these committees together and to give them reasonable supervision and guidance. They are just waiting to be formed. 4. We need an adequate number of fully qualified speakers, films, and film strips to take full advantage of the audiences and opportunities that can be provided by these ad hoc committees. This requires only a direct and straightforward expansion, about fivefold, of activities in which we are already successfully engaged and have had plenty of experience. And again, it should be remembered that for every 100 people these speakers reach in their nightly paying audiences, they average to reach at least 1,000 in their free daily appearances in the same areas before high school assemblies and service clubs and other organized groups and over local radio and television stations. 5. We need an average of 4 American opinion libraries in each district, or a total of about 2,000 throughout the 50 states. They will serve not only as bookstores, but also increasingly as physical headquarters for meetings, film showings, and other activities of conservatives within their respective areas. 6. We need to continue and increase our book publishing activities. The demand just for books of history alone, which tell the truth about many important events of the past 200 years, is going to increase enormously with and contribute solidly to a growing understanding of the conspiracy. 7. We need a paid circulation for American opinion of 200,000 copies, with a corresponding growth in the number and impact of its reprints. We also need a huge increase in the circulation of the Review of the News, but in this case, we cannot estimate the desirable level. We have never taken our eyes off these goals, my friends, and they not only can be reached, but they must be reached. For to the best of our actual knowledge and honest belief, there simply is no other way and no other chance of saving our country from the horror that now looms so near at hand. D. And now by this time it should be clear that the John Birch Society is no ephemeral organization of loose ties and uncertain loyalties. We are not going through a lot of pretty motions, but are building very solidly for decades to come. And we mean business every step of the way. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, let me point out that if and when you join the John Birch Society, and while you are a member, we are a demanding organization. We expect, and goodness knows we receive, far more work and dedication and far more sacrifice of other interests on the part of our members than you are likely ever to have given a thought of giving to any other organization outside of your church. Because we are looking for pullers at the oars and not passengers in the boat. And you do not deserve a place among what is truly the finest body of men and women in the world unless you are willing to do your share according to your circumstances and your ability. We have established fundamental and permanent objectives, much broader than the fight against the communist conspiracy, because we are convinced that the ultimate long-range objectives are more important than the defeat of the communist conspiracy, but also because we are utterly convinced that we cannot stop the communists unless our efforts are a part of such a broader and more constructive purpose. Yet it is the grip of the communist conspiracy which engages our attention so urgently today. Stopping the communists and destroying their conspiracy or at least breaking its grip on our government and shattering its power within the United States, not only must occupy the most important spot in all of our thinking, it is the driving danger which should determine our thoughts today about almost everything else, and most of our actions too, for the foreseeable future. For unless we can win that battle, the war for a better world will again be carried on through long and futile dark ages. After we have been killed, our children have been enslaved, and all that we value has been destroyed. This is not rhetoric, and it is not exaggeration. It is a plain statement of the stark danger that is rapidly closing in on us right now. And we ask you in all sincerity, ladies and gentlemen, if the John Birch Society does not play the leading role in stopping the communists, just who is there to do so? The communists pretend to believe, and some of them undoubtedly do believe, that communism is the wave of the future. We believe instead that the whole world is now tired of so much strife and bestiality, treason and immorality, cruelty and confusion, blasphemy and destructiveness, bitterness and fear, doubt and despair that always go hand in hand with communism. We believe that mankind may be about ready to arise, shake off this communist tyranny and terror, and move forward again towards a more enlightened and humane existence. We are doing everything in our power, by all honorable means, to create the understanding that will produce this result. If you have what it takes, in character and in courage, then by all means join us now in our epic undertaking, with the added effort of people like yourself, and with God's help, when and because we have deserved it, we shall break up this immense criminal conspiracy and return a world gone crazy to sanity once again.